Hello everyone, tonight I've got 10 special scary stories for all of you. I know many of you watch these videos to fall asleep, so before that, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Creepy Sinister. And don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable and let's begin. It was the first summer I spent completely alone. I thought the isolation by the lake would be peaceful until I realized I wasn't alone at all. My name is Logan, and this happened a few years ago at my grandparents' cabin in northern Minnesota. I've been going there my whole life, ever since I was a little kid. The cabin sits on a quiet lake, down a long dirt road with no streetlights and barely any neighbors. Behind it, stretching out into the dark water, is a rotting wooden dock that used to be my favorite place in the world. The dock was old even when I was a kid. A lot of the planks were gray and warped, some of them soft in the middle if you stepped too hard. It creaked and flexed when you walked on it, and my grandpa always warned me not to run out there. The lake itself is pretty deep, and the water goes from clear to black in only a few feet. You can't see the bottom once you get past the first few boards. When I was younger, that darkness under the dock felt mysterious and exciting. As I got older, it started to feel like something else. Fishing off that dock was the one constant during every visit. I knew where the bass liked to hide, where the weeds dropped off into deeper water, and where the big fish would circle under the boards around sunset. I'd sit out there for hours, a folding chair and an old tackle box beside me, listening to the frogs and the distant hum of boats from the other side of the lake. During the day, the place was peaceful. It's at night that the lake changes. The open water turns into this big, silent black surface, and anything more than a few feet from shore just vanishes into nothing. My grandparents have a lot of little rules about the lake. Don't swim after dark. Don't go out on the dock during a storm. Don't fish alone if the fog rolls in. When I was younger, I thought it was just old people's paranoia. As I got older, I noticed how they'd sometimes glance toward the dock at night like they were checking if it was still there. My grandma especially hated hearing the lake at night. She'd close the windows when the wind picked up, even if it made the cabin stuffy and hot. The first weird thing I remember happened when I was around 12. I was out on the dock late, later than I should have been, with my grandpa. The sky was almost black, but there was still a bit of deep blue near the horizon. We were packing up to go inside when I saw something move just under the boards. It looked like a pale shape sliding through the water, right beneath where I was standing. I thought it was a big fish at the time, maybe a muskie. When I told my grandpa, he just said, "Fish get big in this lake," and started ushering me back to the cabin. Over the years, little things like that kept happening. Once I felt something brush my bare ankle when I sat with my feet hanging off the side of the dock. The water was calm and clear, and I didn't see anything there, but the touch was cold and solid like a hand or a thick piece of rope. Another time, my cousin lost a whole stringer of fish he had tied to one of the posts. We came back an hour later, and the rope was still there, but it was frayed and shredded, and the stainless steel clip was bent. My grandpa blamed snapping turtles. We didn't question it. That summer alone at the cabin came when I was 19. My grandparents had gone to visit my aunt for a couple of weeks, and they asked me to stay at the lake place to keep an eye on it. I had my own car, enough food, and just enough responsibility to feel grown up. There was no Wi-Fi, barely any cell reception, and the nearest town was 20 minutes away. My plan was to fish, read, and relax. Honestly, I was excited to have that dock all to myself. My routine settled in quickly. I'd wake up, make coffee, and sit on the porch while the mist lifted off the lake. During the day, I'd fish from the dock or the little aluminum rowboat tied to it, then grill dinner on the old charcoal grill next to the cabin. At night, I liked sitting on the dock in the dark with just a headlamp or a small flashlight, listening to the water gently slap against the posts. The first few nights were quiet, a little eerie, but in a normal way. The kind of quiet that feels big, not threatening. The knocking started halfway through the week. It was around 10 at night, and I was sitting near the end of the dock with my legs crossed, watching the faint reflection of the moon on the water. The surface was almost completely still. Then I heard it, a dull, hollow knock from somewhere under the boards. It sounded like someone had hit the underside of the dock with an open hand once, just one solid thud. I froze for a second, then laughed at myself, and assumed it was a log bumping the posts or a fish jumping against the surface. A minute later, there was another knock, this time a little closer to where I sat. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. I could feel it in the boards beneath me more than I heard it in the air. I waited, listening, and then it came again. Knock, pause, knock. The space between each knock wasn't perfectly even, but it was close. Almost like a slow, heavy heartbeat or someone breathing through their mouth and tapping along with it. The rhythm kept going for maybe 30 seconds before it stopped. I leaned over the side, shining my small flashlight down into the water next to the dock, but all I could see was my own reflection and a faint green glow from the lake weeds. It was too dark under the boards to see anything. Eventually I shrugged it off, told myself it was the wood settling or something brushing against it, and went inside. but I couldn't completely shake the pattern of those knocks out of my head that night. The next evening, I went back out to the dock around the same time without really thinking about it. The sky was darker than the night before, thick clouds covering the stars. I stayed closer to the shore this time, near the middle of the dock. For a while, nothing happened. Then, just as I stood up to go back in, I heard it again. Knock. This time it came from directly under my right foot. I actually flinched and stepped back. A few seconds passed, and then there was another knock, slightly behind me, like something had moved under the beams. I decided to test it. I took a couple of slow steps toward the end of the dock. A few seconds later, knock. A few more steps and another knock from a different spot. Whatever it was, the sound seemed to be following my movement, but always lagging behind by a couple of seconds. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it had to be the water pressure shifting as I moved, or the dock flexing, some dumb natural explanation. Even so, I found myself speed-walking back to the cabin, glancing down at the boards the whole way. The day after that, I called my grandpa from the porch just to check in and casually mention the knocking. There was a pause on the line longer than it should have been. Then he just said, "It's an old dock, Logan. Wood swells and critters bump into it. Just don't go out there too late, okay?" His voice had this forced lightness to it that I didn't like. When I asked if he'd ever heard it knock when he was alone, he changed the subject. That was the first time I realized he might be more afraid of the lake than he ever let on. That night the power went out. A storm had rolled through earlier in the evening, and by around 9 the sky was pitch black except for occasional distant flashes of lightning. I lit a couple of candles inside the cabin, but it was sweltering hot with all the windows closed. The only place that felt remotely cool was outside, near the water. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my bigger flashlight and walked down the short path to the dock. The woods around the clearing were completely dark, the trees just a wall of black shapes. I stepped onto the dock and it creaked under my weight. The lake was calmer than I expected after a storm, just a few gentle ripples. I walked slowly about halfway out and then just stood there listening. At first, all I heard was the faint lapping of water against the shore. Then faintly from somewhere beneath me came that same hollow sound, knock. It felt like it traveled up through my shoes into my legs. This time, though, it didn't come as a set of spaced out hits. It came in a pattern. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. The pattern repeated a few times, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it was slightly slower than the beat of my own heart. Once I noticed that, I couldn't unhear it. It sounded like breathing slowed down and turned into impact. The boards under my feet seemed to rise just a tiny bit with each knock, like something big was pushing against the bottom of the dock to make the sound. I swept my flashlight across the surface of the water, but there was nothing there. No log, no fish, nothing that could be making that noise. I don't know how long I stayed there, frozen. The knocking went on for maybe a full minute, then stopped abruptly, like someone holding their breath. Everything went silent again, but it wasn't the comfortable kind of silence from the first nights. It was tight and heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something. I backed slowly off the dock and went into the cabin, locking the door and double-checking the latch on the windows. It felt stupid even as I did it, but the image of that black water pressed right up under the boards wouldn't leave my head. Sleep that night was shallow and broken. At some point I woke up to complete darkness. The digital clock next to my bed was off because of the power outage, but when I checked my phone it said 2:14 a.m. I don't know why that time stuck with me, but it did. What woke me wasn't a loud sound. It was something small and repetitive. I lay there for a few seconds, trying to figure out what I was hearing, before I realized it was coming from outside. It was the knocking again, faint but steady. I got out of bed and went to the window that faced the lake. From there I could just barely see the outline of the dock against the water, a darker shape on the black surface. Lightning flickered far away, lighting everything up for half a second at a time. In those brief flashes, I could see the dock bobbing very slightly, as if something was moving under it. The knocking had this weird way of sounding both muffled and close, like it was traveling through the wood and into the ground. Every instinct told me to stay inside, but something about hearing that sound while looking at the dock made it worse. I thought if I could just see what was under there, I'd prove to myself it was nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, which I had left on the kitchen counter, and slipped on a pair of shoes. The cabin felt even more silent when I turned the handle and stepped out onto the small back porch. The knocking didn't stop. If anything, it got slightly louder the closer I got to the dock. Walking down that short path in the dark felt like moving in a dream. The flashlight beam cut through the first few feet of tall grass and then hit the start of the dock. The boards looked almost white in the light, the gaps between them like thin black lines. As soon as my foot touched the first plank, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was so sudden it actually made my ears almost ring. For a second I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing, if I had just woken up already scared and filled in the rest. I took a cautious step forward. The wood creaked, but that was normal. I moved another few feet, my flashlight sweeping the surface of the water to my left and right. It was still. No wind, no waves, nothing. The only movement was the faint shimmer of my light in the reflection. Then, just as I reached the middle of the dock, I felt it. Not a sound this time, but a sensation through the soles of my shoes. A slow, deliberate push upward from directly beneath the board I was standing on, like something big had pressed its back against the underside. The board flexed under me and then sank back down. A second later, the knock came. It was so loud up close that it made me jump. My flashlight shook in my hand, the beam jerking over the water. Another push, another punch of sound from underneath. Knock, knock, knock. This time there was no steady rhythm. I felt frustrated, almost angry. I dropped to my knees without really deciding to, crawling closer to the edge so I could lean over and shine the light under the dock. Looking straight down from above, there wasn't much to see, just black water and my own distorted reflection in the center of the beam. But when I shifted my weight and leaned my upper body off the side of the dock, angling the flashlight under the boards, the light hit the space just beneath them. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a pale rock or something, but then it moved in a way rocks don't. A rounded white shape floated just under the surface, directly under the spot where I had been standing. It was too smooth and too even in color, and there were dark shapes drifting around it like hair. The pale shape slowly tilted upward, revealing the curve of a forehead, the suggestion of a nose, and then two deep, shadowed pits where eyes should be. As the face rolled into the light, I realized it wasn't completely still. Tiny streams of bubbles were escaping from its slightly open mouth, flowing upward in short bursts. Every time a cluster of bubbles rose, I felt a corresponding knock travel through the wood of the dock into my arms and chest. It was like the thing was exhaling against the underside of the boards, hitting them with each breath. The eyes, or the black hollows where the eyes would have been, were fixed on me. Even through the moving water, even with the distorted beam of my flashlight, I got the clear, bone-deep sense that it was aware of me, not just as something above it, but as a specific person. The hair, or what I thought was hair, fanned out in the water, trailing off into darkness. The skin looked wrong. It was too pale, almost bluish, but not bloated like you'd expect from something that had been in the water a long time. It was smooth and tight over the shape of the skull. I stayed there, hanging halfway off the dock, completely frozen. My brain was trying to convince me I was looking at a drowned body, that some poor person had ended up under the dock and gotten stuck somehow. But nothing about how it moved fit that explanation. The face didn't bob or drift. It held its position directly below me as if something unseen was anchoring it there. The bubbles kept coming in those short bursts, and the knocking kept answering each one from the wood between us. Then one of its arms unfolded out of the darkness. The hand was the worst part. It was so long, with fingers that seemed just a little too thin and too straight. They didn't curl naturally. They extended outward, stopping just inches below the surface of the water, as if something invisible was holding them back from touching the bottom of the dock. The hand hovered there, directly under the board my chest was pressed against. Even through the wood, I felt this cold pressure on my ribs, like it was reaching for me and almost making contact. Something in me snapped. I pushed back hard, scrambling awkwardly onto my hands and knees, then my feet. As I did, there was a massive, sudden slam against the underside of the dock, right where I had been leaning. The impact was so strong it actually lifted the boards under me a fraction of an inch. My flashlight flew out of my hand and skidded toward the edge before bouncing once and tumbling off into the water. It hit the surface still on, and for a brief second, its beam shone straight up from beneath the dock like a spotlight. In that second, I saw the thing clearly. It wasn't just a face. The top half of a pale, human-like figure was pressed against the underside of the dock at an impossible angle, as if the water had no effect on it. Its arms were spread wide, fingers splayed, palms flat against the wood. Its head was tilted back so far that the neck looked broken, eyes rolled up and locked on me, and a mouth stretched open in a silent scream that let out nothing but streams of bubbles. Then the flashlight sank deeper, the beam fading as it went, and the image melted into darkness. I bolted. I don't remember getting off the dock. I just remember my feet hitting the dirt path and my lungs burning by the time I reached the cabin. I slammed the door behind me, locked it, then locked it again. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to dial 911. When the operator answered, I didn't even know how to explain what was happening. I think I said something like, "There's something in the lake under my dock," and that I thought there might be a body. The dispatcher said she'd send the county sheriff, but warned me it could take a while because of the weather and how far out I was. She asked if I was in immediate danger. I looked around the cabin, listening. The knocking had stopped once I left the dock, but now that I was paying attention, I could hear the faint sloshing of water against the shore again. I told her I was inside with the doors locked. She told me to stay there, keep my phone closed, and wait. Those 40 minutes felt like hours. When the sheriff finally pulled up the dirt road, his headlights swept across the front of the cabin, making me jump. He was an older guy, calm in the way that people get after seeing a lot of weird things. I tried to describe what I'd seen as we walked down to the dock together, his flashlight cutting a much stronger beam through the night than mine had. By the time we got there, the lake was back to its usual calm. No bubbles, no movement, nothing under the boards but black water. My flashlight was gone, probably on the bottom somewhere. He shone his light under the dock, checking the posts and the water line. "If there's a body, it'd float," he said after a minute. "Are you sure you weren't seeing a reflection? Storms can mess with the water and make it look weird." I knew how it sounded, and I could hear doubt in his voice, but I also noticed something he almost missed. On the underside of one of the boards near the shore, just above the water level, were 4 deep, narrow grooves running parallel to each other. They looked exactly like claw marks or fingernail scratches dragged down the wood. When I pointed them out, he frowned and bent closer. "Could be an animal," he muttered, though his tone wasn't as confident as before. "Turtles, maybe muskrats." There were no muskrats big enough to leave marks like that. The grooves were spaced like fingers, almost all the same length. He took a couple of pictures and then said he'd make a note of it, but by the time he left, it was clear there wasn't much more he was going to do. There was nobody, no obvious crime. Just a scared kid and an old dock on a dark lake. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat at the kitchen table with every light in the cabin on, drinking coffee and staring out the back window, watching for any sign of movement near the water. The knocking never came back while I was awake. The next morning, as soon as there was enough daylight, I called my grandparents. I tried to sound calm, but my voice still shook when I told them they needed to come back. I didn't go near the dock at all that day. I couldn't even look at it for more than a second without seeing that face beneath it in my head. My grandparents cut their visit short and came up the following day. When my grandpa saw the marks under the board and heard everything I told him, his face went pale in a way I hadn't seen before. He didn't argue, didn't try to laugh it off. He just said, "We've been talking about replacing that old dock anyway." By the end of the week, he had a couple of local guys out there with tools, tearing the whole thing apart. I watched from the shore as they pulled up each board, revealing the black water beneath and the posts that had been hidden for decades. On one of the posts near where I had seen the thing, there was something dark tangled around it, swaying in the current. One of the workers thought it was weeds at first, but when he pulled it free, it looked more like a clump of long, dark hair mixed with lake plants. He tossed it into a trash bag without thinking much of it. My grandpa saw it and wouldn't look me in the eye. Later, when we were alone, he finally told me that people had drowned in that lake before. A teenage boy from a neighboring cabin had gone missing there when my grandpa was young. They never found his body. I don't know if what I saw was him. I don't know if it was ever human at all. Maybe something in that water took on the shape of a person because it had been under there for so long, pressed up against the space between the surface and the boards. All I know is that the feeling of it watching me wasn't new. Thinking back, I can remember other nights on that dock when I felt like something was directly underneath me, just out of sight. Maybe it had been there my whole life, waiting for the right moment or the right person to finally show itself. My grandparents built a new dock the next summer, farther down the shoreline where the water is shallower. It's shorter and sturdier, and they don't let anyone fish off it at night anymore. They act like it's just because they're older and more cautious now, but I see the way they avoid looking at the spot where the old dock used to be. There's nothing there now but smooth water and a darker patch of lake where the posts once went down into the depths. If you stand there long enough, you start to notice how that part of the lake doesn't ripple quite the same as the rest. I moved back to the city after all this, but being around water has never felt the same. I won't swim in lakes, and even docks at other places make my chest tight. A couple of years later, a friend invited me to his parents' cottage on a completely different lake in a different state. I almost said no, but I didn't want to sound crazy. One night I was there alone, sitting on their dock while he was inside making drinks. It was calm and quiet, a different dock, a different lake, a different life. I tried to tell myself I was fine. Then from directly under where I was sitting, I heard it, a single hollow knock, just one. The exact same pitch, the same dull vibration through the wood that I remembered. I froze, my whole body going cold. The water there was clear enough to see my reflection in the shallow bottom, but the sound hadn't come from where my feet were. It had come from under the darker section a few boards out, where the water turned deep and green. I didn't lean over to look this time. I just stood up, walked back to the house, and didn't go near that dock again. I tell myself it was just the wood settling, or some fish bumping the posts, or my brain filling in patterns it was afraid of. But that's the thing that keeps me up some nights. It didn't sound random. It sounded familiar, like something that had been under a different dock in a different year had found a way to remind me it was still there. And every now and then, if I'm in a quiet room at night and the plumbing in the walls creaks just right, I swear I can feel that slow, heavy knocking traveling up through the floor, like something is breathing just beneath where I'm standing, waiting for the boards between us to get old enough to break. Back in the summer of 2021, I went night fishing with my cousin on a big rural lake near where I grew up in Arkansas. I used to think the scariest thing about being out there in the dark was maybe a snake dropping into the boat or the motor dying in the middle of the night. After that night, I started thinking a lot less about stuff you can explain and a lot more about the things you can't. My name is Marcus. I was 19 at the time, and the lake I'm talking about was about 40 minutes outside of town. It wasn't some busy tourist lake with jet skis and bars on the water. It was mostly locals, a few scattered cabins, and a lot of open water and woods. My uncle had this old aluminum John boat he kept at a friend's property on the lake, and he told us we could use it that weekend. The plan was simple: go out late, anchor in this quiet cove he recommended, and fish until we got tired. My cousin Tyler was 23, a little older, and way more into fishing than I was. He worked early shifts at a tire shop, so he liked nights where everything was still and you could just sit in the dark with a rod and some beers. He picked me up around 9 p.m. in his beat-up Silverado with the boat trailer already hitched up. We grabbed gas station snacks, some extra ice, and a couple of headlamps with fresh batteries. I remember feeling excited, but there was also this heaviness in the air that night, like a storm that never actually came. We launched the boat at a small public ramp that was basically just a concrete slope with a single light on a pole. There were only 2 other trucks in the gravel lot, and we didn't see any other boats out on the water when we pushed off. The lake was massive and dark, just this black sheet broken up by a few distant dock lights. It was one of those nights where the sky was clear and the stars reflected off the surface when the water was calm. It felt peaceful more than anything at first. My uncle had told us about a cove on the far side of the lake where the catfish were supposed to be good at night. We followed the GPS on Tyler's phone, the screen lighting up his face in the dark while he steered. The motor was old but still dependable, making that steady low growl as we cut across the open water. The farther we got from the ramp, the smaller that single yellow parking lot light became behind us. Eventually it was just gone, and it was like the world shrank to whatever was inside the circle of our boat. We cut the motor when we got near the cove, letting the boat glide for a while before dropping anchor. The shoreline around us was mostly trees and brush, with one small dock way off to our left that had a light on at the end of it. You couldn't see the house, just that one orange bulb reflecting on the water. We got our lines set up, cracked a couple beers, and settled in. The only sounds were bugs, the occasional splash from a fish, and the soft creak of metal whenever the boat rocked. I remember checking my phone at one point and seeing it was around 11:40 p.m. Tyler was already focused, staring at his bobber like he could will something to bite. I was more in people-watching mode, except there weren't any people, just a huge, quiet lake and a lot of darkness. I'd pan my eyes around every once in a while, just taking it in. The night out there was a different kind of dark than in town. It had weight to it. It was probably around midnight when I first heard the sound, just a faint metallic clink like aluminum tapping against something. I thought it was our boat at first, the anchor rope tightening or the hull gently knocking against some submerged log, but the sound didn't sync with our movement. It came again, a little clearer, and I realized it was somewhere out on the water around us, not under us. I squinted out into the dark past the tip of my rod, trying to see where it might be coming from. There was a thin haze over parts of the lake, not really fog, just this slight blur that made distant shapes look softer. After a second or two, my eyes adjusted enough that I noticed a darker shape out to our right, maybe a couple 100 yards away toward the more open part of the lake. It was low to the water and long, and after a moment I realized it was another small aluminum boat. At first I didn't think much of it. People night fish all the time. I just figured it was some guy running jug lines or catfishing like us. But the longer I looked at it, the stranger it felt. There were no lights on it at all. No headlamp, no little lantern glow, nothing. Just a dark silhouette sitting in the water, and this was the part that really stuck with me. It looked like there was a figure sitting dead center, facing straight ahead. "Hey dude," I said quietly to Tyler, kind of not wanting to break the quiet but feeling weird about it. "You see that?" I nodded in the direction of the shape. Tyler leaned forward, resting his hand on the side of the boat as he squinted where I pointed. It took him a second, but then he nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I see it. Huh, no lights." His voice sounded casual, but I could hear that edge of curiosity there, the same as I felt. We both watched for a while, just waiting for the person to do something normal, adjust their seat, grab a pole, turn their head, something. But the shape in the middle of that boat stayed perfectly still. The only movement I could see was the slight drift of it in the water, its dark outline shifting just a little against the faint gray of the lake's surface. The more I stared, the more certain I was that whoever was in that boat was just sitting there, upright, facing straight forward like they were staring at nothing. Tyler reached down near his tackle box and pulled out this cheap handheld spotlight he kept in the boat. "Maybe he doesn't realize he's out here with no lights," he said. "I'll just flash him real quick." For some reason, I felt a wave of discomfort when he said that. Like shining a light at this guy would make whatever felt off about this finally snap into focus. "Maybe just leave him," I muttered, but I don't think Tyler even heard me. He clicked the spotlight on and pointed it toward where the boat had been. The beam cut across the water, lighting up little waves and bugs in the air. For For a split second, I lost the exact spot where the silhouette had been because my eyes adjusted to the brightness. Then Tyler steadied his hand, and the light landed on the other boat, only it wasn't where it had been a few seconds ago. I felt my stomach drop in this weird, delayed way, like when you stumble on a step you didn't know was there. Instead of being way out toward the middle of the lake, the aluminum boat was now maybe half the distance closer to us than I remembered. It was just there in the beam, quiet, with the same dark figure sitting straight in the middle, still facing forward. I thought I was going crazy. There was no motor sound, no splashing. The water around it was smooth. It was like somebody had picked it up and set it down closer. Tyler lowered the light a bit, then brought it back up like maybe he'd just mis-aimed it the first time. "What the hell?" he whispered. That was when I knew he was seeing the same thing I was. "We must have drifted," I said automatically, trying to give my brain something simple to hang on to. Tyler shook his head slightly. "Anchor been steady. We didn't move like that," he said. I looked down at the anchor rope. It was taut, leading straight down into the water. We kept the light on the other boat for another few seconds. The glare bounced off the metal hull and made it hard to see much detail. I could make out that the person sitting in the middle seemed to be wearing a dark hoodie, hood up, and maybe a hat bill sticking out of the shadow. Their hands were resting on their knees or thighs. They weren't holding a rod, and there was no cooler or gear that I could see. Just them, sitting there like a mannequin. Tyler clicked the light off to let the batteries rest a bit. The darkness came back fast and full, and for a few seconds all I could see was the blob of afterimage burned into my eyes. The night seemed twice as dark after that bright beam. We sat there in silence, listening. The metallic clink came again, closer now. You know how sometimes you can't explain why a sound feels wrong, but it just does? That's exactly how it felt. "I don't like this," I finally said. "Maybe we should move, go closer to the ramp or something." Tyler shrugged, but it wasn't that confident shrug he usually did. "It's probably just some weird guy," he said. "We'll give him some space." He said that, but he grabbed his phone from the tackle box and pulled up a map app with GPS. You could see our boat as this little blue dot in the cove. He zoomed out a bit, took a breath, and then put the phone down again like he was trying to reassure himself more than me. We tried to go back to fishing, or at least Tyler did. I just sat there with my rod in my hand, basically forgotten, watching the dark. Every tiny sound made me flinch. A fish broke the surface somewhere behind us, and I almost dropped my line. After what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably more like 3, Tyler picked up the spotlight again. "One more quick look," he said. "If he's still creeping, we'll head in." This time I didn't try to talk him out of it. I kind of needed to see it too, to either prove to myself we'd imagine the distance change or that it was something obvious and dumb. He flicked the light back on and swept the beam over the water. It hit the shore first, then slid back toward the middle of the lake. When it finally caught the other boat again, I felt my heart jump in my chest so hard I actually gasped. The aluminum boat was now maybe 50 feet away, if that. It was close enough that I could see the droplets of water on its sides where the spotlight reflected. Close enough that if he stood up and threw something, it would land in our boat. The figure in the middle was still sitting, but this time their head was turned, not toward the shore, not toward the open water. Their head was turned directly toward us. Tyler froze with the light in his hand, the beam locked on the guy's face. I couldn't see a lot of detail because of the way the shadows fell under the hood and cap, but I could see just enough. A pale strip of nose, a hint of a jawline, eyes that weren't reflecting like animal eyes do, but somehow still seemed wrong. Too dark, too fixed, like they weren't really looking at our faces, but past us. "Hey man," Tyler called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Are you okay out here?" No answer. The figure didn't raise a hand, didn't shift in his seat, and didn't even blink as far as I could tell. Just sat there, staring dead at us. The only sound was the water lightly lapping against both of our boats and the high, distant buzz of bugs somewhere on shore. I realized I was gripping the edge of our boat so hard my fingers hurt. Something about the whole situation felt like a broken video, like the frames were out of order. The guy's boat didn't appear to be drifting. It just jumped between where we'd seen it in our memory and where it was now. Tyler slowly lowered the light so it wasn't directly in the guy's face anymore, like he was afraid of pissing him off. "Screw this," he muttered. "I'm starting the motor. We'll fish somewhere else." He set the spotlight down so it was still on, but pointing at the water between our boats. The other boat was on the edge of the beam now, almost in a weird partial silhouette. Tyler reached back and yanked the starter cord on the old outboard. It sputtered, coughed, and died. He yanked it again, and again. Each time, the engine made that choking sound like it wanted to catch but couldn't. I felt that horrible, helpless feeling you get when something you rely on won't work. While he was trying to start it, I found myself looking back at the other boat. It had not moved, as far as I could tell. The figure was still in the same position, still locked in that unnatural stillness, still looking in our direction. I realized I couldn't see any registration numbers on the hull. No stickers, no marks, just bare, dull metal. "Maybe we should kill the light," I said quietly. "Maybe he thinks we're messing with him." Tyler ignored me, pulling the cord harder. On the 4th or 5th try, the motor finally roared to life, startling both of us. The boat vibrated under our feet. Tyler grabbed the tiller and threw a quick glance at me. "Grab the anchor," he said. "Let's go." I moved to the front of the boat and started hauling the anchor rope in, my hands shaking. It had a bit of resistance at first, then came up smooth. When I turned back, Tyler was swinging the nose of our boat toward the open water, away from the cove. In the process, the beam of the spotlight swept across the water and briefly passed over the other aluminum boat again. Only this time the image burned into my memory as of it being 50 feet away. It was right there, close enough that if I'd reached my arm out over the side, I honestly think I could have touched it. The man in the boat wasn't just facing us anymore. His head was tilted slightly, as if he'd leaned forward, like he was curious. I yelled something, I don't even remember exactly what, just a shout of pure panic. Tyler jerked the light back instinctively, but in that split second I saw something that still makes my skin crawl. The man's mouth was slightly open, not wide, not like a scream or anything, just open enough that it looked like he was mid-word, but there was no sound, and his eyes, in that sudden burst of brightness, looked not just dark, but almost hollow. Not empty sockets, nothing supernatural you could point to, just an absence of anything you could read as normal human emotion. The next second we were moving. The motor pushed us forward and the other boat slipped out of the beam to our left side. I didn't dare look back at it. I focused on the water ahead and the faint lights near the main part of the lake. The wind felt colder all of a sudden and my heart was racing like we were being chased. Every time the boat hit a little wave, I flinched, half expecting to feel a hand grabbing the side. We headed straight back toward that single parking lot light we'd left behind earlier, but as we got closer to the dock, we saw something else. Another boat was tied there now, a small bass boat with two older guys unloading gear into a truck. They turned when they heard our motor and watched us come in way faster than most people do near the ramp. Tyler cut the engine late, and we coasted a little too hard into the side of the dock, bumping it. "You boys all right?" one of the men asked. He sounded more annoyed than concerned, but his eyes stayed on us like he was checking for something. Tyler forced out a quick laugh and said we were fine, just weren't used to the motor. I was shaking too much to even speak. I just grabbed the rope and tied us off with clumsy hands. The whole time I felt like if I turned around, I'd see that featureless aluminum boat sliding silently into the glow of the ramp light behind us. We loaded up the truck in record time. The two older guys didn't say much else, just gave us a couple sideways glances as they drove off. When they pulled out of the lot, it was just us and that one buzzing pole light again. Tyler finally broke the silence while we were winching the boat onto the trailer. "You saw it closer too, right?" he asked, not looking at me. "It wasn't just me." I swallowed and nodded. "It shouldn't have been that close," I said, not without us hearing something. We sat in the truck for a while before even pulling out, both of us staring at the dark ramp like the guy in the aluminum boat might suddenly appear there, just standing on the concrete. Tyler eventually put the keys in and started the engine, the normal car sounds feeling almost surreal after the silence on the water. "Should we call somebody?" I asked. "Like the sheriff or something?" Tyler thought about it for a second, then shrugged. "Tell them what? Some dude was weird in a boat," he said. "He didn't actually do anything." I didn't push it, but that drive back felt wrong the entire way. Every set of headlights that passed us made me jump. When I got home, it was a little after 2:30 a.m. I remember that because I checked the time right before I locked the front door behind me. I went straight to my room, closed the blinds, and lay in bed fully dressed, replaying everything in my head. The distances, the silence. That moment his boat was suddenly right next to ours. The next day, after barely sleeping, I texted Tyler and asked if he'd filmed any of it. He said he had a couple short clips when he was messing with the spotlight, but he hadn't looked at them yet. He sent them over to me. The first one started with the boat way out, just a dark blob. When he swept the light across it, there was a brief moment where it looked farther away than I remembered, then closer again when the beam stabilized. It was like the video itself couldn't decide where the boat was. In the second video, the one from when the boat was 50 feet away, the weirdness was even worse. Tyler's hand is a little shaky with the spotlight and the beam is bouncing, but you can clearly see the aluminum hull and the figure in the middle. There's a split-second frame. If you pause it right, you can see the boat suddenly closer, then back, then closer again. Not smoothly moving, just skipping. The audio is just water sounds and us breathing. No engine, no oar splashes, nothing from him. I showed the videos to my uncle later that day. I didn't tell him everything about how it felt, just that some guy creeped us out. He watched, squinting at the screen, then handed my phone back. "Could be the light messing with the camera," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. "That cove, weird sometimes. Shallow in spots. People get stuck back there more than you'd think." That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. It actually made me wonder where exactly that other boat had been sitting in relation to the bottom. Over the next few weeks, I found myself going back to those videos a lot. I'd pause them frame by frame, trying to catch anything. A clearer look at the guy's face, some clue on the side of the boat, a reflection that explained the jumps. The more I looked, the less sense it made. On one frame, the distance between us and him looked reasonable. On the next, if you measured using how wide the spotlight beam appeared on his hull, it seemed like he was right beside us. But we never see it moving between those positions. It's just here, then there. What finally pushed this from creepy memory into I still think about this at night was something I found about a month later. I hadn't told anyone else about what happened, but I'd been looking up stories online about that lake, accidents, drownings, anything like that. One night, I came across a small local news article from back in 2008 about a man who'd gone missing while night fishing on that same lake. They never found his body, just his empty aluminum boat drifting near the far end of the lake early one morning. There was a photo of him in the article, just a regular middle-aged guy wearing a dark hoodie and a baseball cap, smiling stiffly at the camera. He didn't look exactly like the man in our videos. You can't really see enough to say for sure, but the similarity made my chest tight. It was close enough that my first thought wasn't, oh, that must be him. It was, what if that's just what my brain wants to see now? But either way, it connected that faceless shape in the aluminum boat to an actual person who had been out there and never came back. I've been on other lakes since that night, but I haven't gone back to that one. Tyler hasn't either, as far as I know. We still talk about it sometimes, but always quickly, like saying too much would make it all happen again. He swears up and down that there was no way that boat got that close without us hearing some kind of movement. I swear up and down that in that last sweep of the spotlight, I saw the guy leaning forward just enough that his shadow shifted, like he was trying to get a better look at us. What bothers me the most isn't even the idea that it could have been something supernatural. It's possible that it was just some man out there, using the dark in our blind spots and the weird way we see distance over water to get closer and closer without us realizing it until it was almost too late. That maybe if the motor hadn't started when it did, we would have heard his boat bump gently against ours, and we would have finally found out what he wanted. And the part I can't shake even now is this. In every frame of those videos, no matter how close or far he seems, he's always facing us. Not the shore, not the open water, not the strip of stars reflected on the lake, just us, like we were the only real thing out there worth paying attention to. This happened during a late-night fishing trip off a saltwater pier 2 summers ago. People always talk about being scared of sharks or storms way out in the deep water, but my fear now comes from something that tried to come up out of the water after me. I still fish, but I stay away from that pier, and I almost never stay out past sunset anymore. Every time I think about going back, I picture that line going tight and those hands on it. Back then I was 21, living with my parents in a small coastal town in North Carolina. I worked long shifts in a warehouse, moving pallets and loading trucks until my back hurt. Fishing was how I reset my brain. I'd throw my rods into my old Tacoma and drive out to the public pier that stuck into the Atlantic like a finger, with orange lights every few yards and the constant thud of waves under the boards. In the daytime it was full of tourists, but at night it felt like a different place. This night was in late August, the kind of heat that sticks to you even after dark. The sky was clear, but the air felt heavy, like there should have been a storm even though there was. My friend Tyler was supposed to come with me, but he texted that he was wiped from work and by late. I almost stayed home, but I was restless and annoyed from my shift, so I went alone. I paid the night fishing fee at the little office and walked out onto the creaking wood with 2 rods and my tackle bag. There were maybe 6 or 7 people on the pier when I got there. An older couple sat on folding chairs near the middle, not even watching their lines. A group of younger guys in hoodies were near the end, drinking from cans and talking way too loud. Under the very last light, all the way at the end, a single man leaned on the railing with no rod, no cooler, nothing. He just stared straight out into the dark ocean. Even from a distance, the way he stood there made me uneasy. I set up in my usual spot about 3/4 of the way down under one of the brighter lights. I baited my lighter rod with shrimp and cast out just to see what was around. Within a few minutes I had a couple of small croakers, nothing worth keeping, but it felt good to be out there. The water was calm, just that steady rolling you can feel through the boards. The sounds all blended together, waves, quiet voices, and the occasional clack of a cooler lid. Every so often I glanced down toward the end of the pier. The loud group slowly started packing up after one of them leaned over the rail for a while, and then they all laughed and left. The older couple reeled in and headed off, their chairs folded under their arms. After a while it was just me, one other fisherman a few yards behind me, and that man at the very end, still in the exact same spot. It felt like the pier stretched farther than usual once everyone else was gone. Around 11, the air cooled a little and the wind picked up off the water. I decided to switch things up and try for something bigger. I put away the light rod, picked up my heavier one, hooked on a chunk of mullet, and cast as far as I could into the dark. The sinker hit with a dull splash and dropped out of sight. I set the rod in the holder, sat down on the bench, and scrolled my phone while watching the tip. After a few minutes, I felt the first little taps, the usual pecking from small fish. The rod twitched, then went still. I was half distracted when it suddenly bent down hard enough that the holder scraped against the rail. I grabbed it with both hands and set the hook. Whatever I connected with on the other end almost pulled me forward a step. It didn't feel like a fish running. It felt like I'd hooked something heavy that was already dug in. I've hooked big rays and drum off that pier before. They surge, run sideways, peel line, and tire themselves out. This thing didn't do any of that. It just pulled straight down and a little out, slow but steady, like a weight that could think. The line hummed under the pressure, and the wood under my boots vibrated with every deep, even pull. Whenever I gained a few cranks, I could feel that same heavy resistance take it right back. The other fisherman walked over and stood beside me for a moment. He asked what I thought it was, and I told him I honestly had no idea. He watched the rod bend and said something about it being a huge ray, then went back to check his own lines. I kept working mine, pumping and reeling, my shoulders starting to burn. What bothered me was how quiet the water stayed. There was no splash, no swirl, nothing at the surface. After a few minutes of fighting it, the angle of my line changed. I could tell whatever I had was coming more straight up than out. I told myself it had to be a big ray or maybe a net or rope snagged on something. About 30 feet out, I noticed a slightly darker patch of water where my line disappeared. It wasn't obvious, just a shape that broke the reflection of the pier lights in a way that didn't feel normal. I squinted into the dark as I kept reeling, and more of that shape rose. Water streamed off something long and narrow that stood almost upright in the water instead of lying flat like a fish. From where I was, it looked like a rolled-up tarp or a bundle of something slick, twisting slightly but never letting the line go loose. The weight on my rod didn't feel like dead weight. It felt like it was holding me back on purpose. Then it drifted just far enough under the light for me to see where my line actually went into it. About 10 feet below the pier, above the black surface, I saw something pale wrapped around the monofilament. It took a second for my mind to accept that I was looking at a hand, not a glove or trash, an actual hand, but too long, with fingers that seemed to have extra joints. They were curled tight around my line like they'd been using it forever. For a split second, I tried to tell myself it was a mannequin arm or some weird prank. Then the fingers flexed. I watched them squeeze the line, digging into it, making the rod jump in my hands. Below that hand, a thin, colorless arm extended down into the water, disappearing into darkness. The skin looked smooth and wrong, like something that didn't belong above the surface at all. Behind me, I heard the other fisherman whisper something like, "You see that, right?" But my eyes stayed locked on the water. The hand started to move along the line in slow, careful motions, sliding toward the pier. It wasn't climbing like a person on a rope. It was almost like the fingers were feeling each tiny section of the line, pulling itself closer inch by inch. More of the arm broke the surface, and when the elbow bent, it folded the wrong way. Off to the side, there was a soft slap of water. Another pale arm rose near one of the pier pilings, dripping as it reached for the slick, algae-coated wood. Its fingers spread wide, feeling along the beam, then grabbed on and stuck there like they had claws or suction. Every time the hand shifted its grip, it left faint dark streaks on the wet wood. Whatever this thing was, it knew exactly how to hold on. My brain ran through every possible explanation in a panic. Some kind of big eel tangled in junk, a trick of the light. A nightmare I'd already fallen into without knowing it, but nothing matched the way those hands moved. They weren't drifting or flopping. They were reaching. They were trying to climb, using my line and the pier like a ladder. That was when I understood what it was doing. It wasn't just on my hook. It was using the tension of the line to pull itself up, closer to the surface and closer to me. Both arms pulled in small, steady motions, like someone hauling themselves up from a pool. Whatever was below stayed out of sight, hidden under the black water. I couldn't see a face or a body, just pale limbs dragging something heavier behind them. Something in me finally broke through the shock. I stumbled back a step and went for the folding knife clipped to my pocket. My fingers were shaking so badly that I dropped it, had to bend down and snatch it off the boards. In that moment, the line went even tighter. The rod bent to an angle I'd never seen before, and the humming from the strain turned high and sharp, right on the edge of snapping. Every fisherman I know hates cutting a line. It feels wrong, like giving up. But watching those hands inch higher on the piling made that habit feel stupid. I stepped closer to the railing, pulled the line toward me, and saw it bite into that pale skin without any reaction. I pressed the knife against the monofilament and sliced. It snapped with a loud crack, and the rod sprang back so hard it almost hit me in the face. The hand reacted instantly. It snatched at the sudden slack like it had expected the pull that wasn't there anymore. For the first time, a sound drifted up from below us. It wasn't a scream or a roar. It sounded like a long, heavy breath being forced out through water, thick and wet, followed by a rush of bubbles. The fingers on the piling scraped at the wood for another second and then slipped. Both arms twisted downward in an awkward, jerky motion and slid back under the surface. As they went, the fingers left 4 or 5 dark parallel streaks down the side of the piling. Then they were gone. The water went back to looking flat and black, rippling a little in the light wind. If you'd walked up right then, you'd have thought we were just two guys staring at nothing. For a while I just stood there holding a rod with a useless, frayed end of line whipping in the breeze. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The other fisherman came to stand next to me, his face pale and tight. In a low voice he asked if I'd seen it too. I nodded, and that was basically the end of that conversation. Neither of us tried to name what we just watched. We packed up in silence. When I picked up my knife, I noticed a faint gray smear on the blade where it had touched the line. The cut end of the monofilament felt rough and sticky when I ran my fingers over it. I wiped the knife on my shorts, even though it didn't really help, and tried not to imagine that stuff coating my hands. As we walked back, I glanced between the boards once and thought I saw something pale flash under the surface, but it could have been anything. Right before we stepped off the pier, I glanced back toward the end. The man who had been standing under the last light was gone. I never heard him walk past us. One moment he'd been a shadow leaning over the rail, the next there was only empty space where he'd been. We didn't say a word to the kid at the counter on the way out. I couldn't picture myself explaining what I'd seen in any way that sounded sane. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hand wrapped around my line, feeling its way up toward me. The next afternoon, when the sun was bright and everything felt more normal, I drove back to the pier just to prove to myself it was in my head. Families were out, kids were running, music was playing from someone's speaker. It felt ridiculous to be scared there in daylight. I walked straight to the spot where I'd been standing and leaned over the rail. At first I only saw the usual wet wood and green growth on the piling. Then I noticed them, 4 or 5 long, narrow streaks running straight down the side of the beam, evenly spaced. They started a little above the low tide line and disappeared into the water. They weren't random scrapes or rope marks. They looked exactly like finger tracks. When I touched one of the streaks, my fingertip came back sticky and faintly gray, the same stuff that had been on my knife. It didn't smell like fish or oil or anything I recognized. I wiped my hand on my shirt, turned around, and left without even opening my tackle bag. On the drive home, every bump in the road felt like something brushing against the bottom of my truck. A couple of weeks later, I ran into the other fisherman at a gas station. We recognized each other right away. After a few awkward seconds, he asked if I'd been back to that pier at night. I told him no. He said he hadn't either, then mentioned he'd told the pier manager that something weird had happened near the end without going into details. According to him, the manager didn't look all that surprised. He said that every summer a few people came in late at night talking about hooking onto something heavy that doesn't fight right in that deeper section. Straight down weight, no side runs, no normal fish behavior. Most of them cut their lines or lost whatever it was. Nobody ever brought in anything to prove what they'd felt. The fisherman didn't mention the hands, and I understood why. It's been a couple of years now. I still fish, but I pick shorter piers and shallower spots, and I almost always go during the day. I watch how my line feels a lot more than I used to. If it ever goes dead heavy and just hangs there, pulling straight down with no movement, I don't wait to see what it is. I tighten the drag, stare at the water for a second, and if it feels even a little familiar, I cut the line and leave. Sometimes I drive past that original pier at night and see the lights stretching out over the water. You can just make out silhouettes of people at the end, rods leaned against the rail, lines running down into the dark. Whenever I see someone's rod bend and stay bent, I catch myself picturing pale arms far below them, feeling along the tension. What scares me most isn't just the sight of those hands or the sound that came up from the water. It's the idea that whatever that thing is needed my line to get closer. It wasn't drifting. It knew how to use the tension like a ladder, like it had done it before. Cutting that line didn't get rid of it. It just dropped it back into the dark with a trick that works, waiting for the next person who reels in something heavy and alive that isn't a fish. This happened on a cold, deep-sea fishing night. I thought the tapping on my window was just branches, but it was. My name is Sarah, and this happened when I was 18. I'm 25 now, and I still can't listen to ocean sounds without my stomach tightening up. I grew up on the coast of North Carolina, and my dad has always been a big saltwater fisherman. Offshore trips were kind of our thing. It was usually just the two of us in his 26-foot center console with the twin outboards, heading out before sunrise and coming back sunburned, tired, and happy. I used to love that feeling of being so far out you couldn't see land anymore. After that night, I don't go out past the pier. My dad had been planning this particular trip for weeks. The weather reports looked good, calm seas with a light north wind, and he'd heard about a spot almost 40 miles out that was loaded with tuna and mahi. It was in the dead of winter, one of those weird, clear, cold stretches where the sky looks extra sharp. I remember waking up at 3 in the morning, layering up in sweats, a hoodie, my dad's extra rain jacket, and wool socks, and still feeling that damp chill in my bones as we loaded the truck in the dark. We launched from a small marina he liked because it was usually quiet and cheaper than the busy tourist ones. The dock lights reflected in the black water, and the only sounds were halyards clinking against masts and the occasional car on the road behind us. I carried the Yeti cooler full of ice and sandwiches while he double-checked the tackle, the gaff, and the bait. Our breath came out in white clouds. The bay was glassy, with just enough ripple to distort the reflections. It felt like we were stepping out of the world and into somewhere else as soon as the boat left the dock. Once we cleared the no-wake zone and he pushed the throttles forward, the motors roared up and the bow lifted. The orange glow from town shrank behind us, and soon it was just black all around with a faint line of lighter black where the sky met the water. I sat up at the front, wrapped in a blanket, watching the spray flare out white in the nav lights and fade into darkness. The GPS screen glowed green on the console, showing our little boat icon headed straight out into a big empty grid. I remember thinking how tiny we looked in all that blue. The first half of the day was completely normal. We got to his waypoint, set lines, and actually hooked into a couple of decent fish. The sun came up, the sky turned clear and pale, and the water turned that deep cobalt blue you only see way offshore. We laughed a lot. We listened to some classic rock on a Bluetooth speaker, and he told the same stories he always told about fishing with his dad. If anything, the weirdness started in such a small way that I almost didn't register it. It was around mid-afternoon when I first noticed the radio. Dad keeps a VHF marine radio mounted by the steering wheel, and normally it's just quiet unless someone talks or the weather alert goes off. I remember hearing a faint, almost hissy chatter under the music, so soft I thought it was part of the song at first. When the song ended, it kept going. It didn't sound like words at that point, just this low murmur, like the sound of a TV through a wall. I looked at the radio and saw that it was completely off. The volume knob was pushed in. "Do you hear that?" I asked him. He stopped what he was doing, listened for a second, then shook his head and said it was probably just the wind, so I let it go. Out there, weird echoes and sounds bouncing off the water don't feel that strange. The ocean has its own background noise. By the time the sun started dipping, I had almost forgotten about it. The plan was to head back in the late afternoon, but he wanted to do one more drift as the sun went down. He always said the bite could get good around sunset. So instead of turning toward home when the sky started going pink, we motored farther out, just another couple of miles, he said. By then the temperature had dropped again, and even with my hood up and my gloved hands in my pockets, my teeth were chattering. The air had that metallic cold you can taste. Night offshore is different than night on land. There are no streetlights, no house windows, no distant traffic, just darkness and stars and whatever light you bring with you. When the sun finally slipped below the horizon, it seemed like someone shut off a dimmer switch. We turned on the deck lights and they cast this harsh white circle over the cockpit, leaving everything beyond the rails in black. The water hugging the boat turned into a shifting mirror of white and ink. Past that, you couldn't see anything. Just the faint green glow from the GPS and the tiny pinpricks of satellites and stars overhead. The feeling of being alone hit me hard once the last faint glow of land disappeared. The wind picked up a little and the boat rocked, but the water still wasn't bad. It was more the silence between the sounds that started to get to me. The motors idled as Dad set us up for another drift, and in the pauses between hull slaps and the low rumble of the engines, there was this presence, not even a sound at first. Just that sense that something else was close, like when someone stands behind you in a quiet room. I went to the stern to check one of the lines. That's when I heard it again more clearly. A murmur just under the surface of the engine noise, like two people whispering at the same time. For a second I thought he'd left the radio on after all. I walked back to the console. The VHF was still off. The speaker was off. My phone was in my pocket on airplane mode because there hadn't been a signal for hours. I stood there, really listening, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. The murmur seemed to be coming from behind the boat, near the motors, or under them. "Dad, do you hear that?" I asked again, a little sharper. He looked up from tying a rig and listened. For a few seconds there was only the creak of something shifting in the cabin and the occasional tap of a rope on the fiberglass. Then it came again, a soft, breathy string of sounds right under us. His eyes met mine, and I could tell from his face that he heard it this time. His jaw tightened, but he tried to play it off. He said it was probably just water moving weird around the props, or maybe some dolphins under the boat. The explanation didn't feel right. Dolphins don't whisper. He decided to kill the engine so we could drift in silence and prove that it was just noise from the motors. The second he turned the key and the rumble died, I felt exposed. There's nothing quite like the silence of a boat sitting in open water at night. You hear tiny things you usually never notice, the slap of a wave, the faint rattle of a loose screw, the wind sliding past your ears. For about 10 seconds, that was all there was. Then, right next to where I was standing by the gunwale, I heard it as clearly as if someone were leaning over the side, cupping their hands around their mouth. "Sarah." My name, drawn out in a slow whisper, coming from just inches above the surface of the water. I actually jerked away from the rail so hard I almost tripped. What did you say? I snapped at my dad, even though I knew it hadn't been his voice. He was 10 feet away at the bow, fiddling with the anchor line. I didn't say anything, he said. He sounded annoyed, but there was something uneasy under it. I stood there, heart pounding, forcing myself to lean back toward the water. The deck light reflected off it in a strip of white that showed nothing but tiny ripples. That's when the whisper came again, only this time it wasn't my name. It was a string of words, soft and low, in a voice that sounded almost like my own, but not quite. Come here, look. The way it said look made my stomach drop. The syllables stretched out just a little too long, like whoever said it wasn't used to talking. I stepped back and yelled for my dad again, my voice cracking. By the time he hustled over, whatever it was had gone quiet. We stood side by side at the stern, staring into the dark water. He tried to laugh it off, saying sound travels weird over water, that maybe it was another boat way off we couldn't see. But I noticed that his hands were gripping the rail so tight his knuckles were pale. There were no other lights out there. No red or green nav lights, no distant glow of a ship, just our little island of white surrounded by black. He decided to start the engines again and slowly head back toward land. I didn't argue. As soon as he turned the key, the boat shuddered and one of the motors made a strange grinding noise like it was struggling against something tangled in the prop. He swore under his breath and backed off the throttle. Probably just some line caught, he said. The ocean was getting a little choppier and the wind felt sharper on my face. I suddenly noticed how cold my hands were inside my gloves. While he messed with the controls, I went into the small cabin for a second to grab another sweatshirt. The cabin has a tiny bench, a little storage locker, and a small window on each side. As I was digging through a duffel bag, I heard a faint tap-tap-tap on the glass above my head, just light enough that if there'd been trees nearby, I would have thought it was branches brushing the window in the wind. Instinctively, that's what my brain thought anyway, even though we were miles from shore. I froze, hoodie half out of the bag, and listened. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was more deliberate, 3 evenly spaced taps, like someone knocking with a fingernail. I swallowed and told myself it was just a loose rope or a clip knocking against the side. I stood up slowly and looked out the window. All I saw was black. The deck lights created a bright reflection on the glass, making it almost impossible to see outside. I adjusted, shielding my eyes to cut the glare, but there was nothing there. No silhouette, no rope, nothing. Just the vague movement of water. The tapping moved, that's the part that really freaked me out. It started on the starboard window, and then after a few seconds I heard the same 3 taps on the port side window instead, as if whatever was doing it had just slid silently past the cabin and tried again on the other side. It wasn't loud, but it was precise. Tap, tap, tap. Each time it hit, it sent this weird vibration through the thin glass that made my teeth feel on edge. I bolted out of the cabin. My dad turned toward me with this "what now" expression, but when he saw my face, he didn't make any jokes. I told him in a rush about the tapping, and we both looked around the cabin windows and the railings. There was nothing hanging loose, no hooks swinging, no rope banging against the hull, just the steady heave of the boat and the hiss of the wind. And underneath it all, almost buried in the sound of the motor struggling, that same low whispering again, like a crowd underwater. "We're going in," he said finally, in a tone that didn't allow argument. He put one engine into gear, the one that wasn't grinding, and tried to coax us forward. The GPS showed us making headway, but it felt like we were moving through syrup. I went to the back again to see if I could spot anything near the props. The water there foamed and swirled in the glow from the deck light like boiling ink. That's when it really escalated. Dad put one engine back in neutral and told me he was going to try to see if something was actually wrapped around the prop on the port side. He knelt at the stern, leaning over just enough to shine his flashlight down between the motor and the water. "Stay back a little," he told me. I stood a few feet away, bracing myself on the rail as the boat dipped and rose. He was muttering to himself, annoyed, talking about cutting whatever line was down there. Over the noise of him talking, over the slap of the waves, I heard his voice again, except it wasn't coming from where he was. It came from directly behind the motor, down near the waterline, the same exact tone and cadence as my dad, but quieter. "Sarah, come here," it whispered. The words crawled straight down my spine. The real my dad didn't react, didn't even look back because he hadn't said it. I could still hear him cursing, slightly out of breath, a couple of feet to my left, while an identical version of his voice, perfectly copied, came from the black gap between the motor and the water. "Hold the light for me," the fake voice added softly. I didn't move, I couldn't. Every instinct I had was screaming not to step closer. The water, there was just a chop of shadow and reflected light, but I knew if I leaned over far enough to shine the flashlight where that voice wanted me to, I'd see something I did not want to see. My hands were shaking so hard I had to clench them into fists. "Dad," I said, my own voice sounding thin in my ears, "get away from the edge." He shot me an irritated look over his shoulder. "I'm just trying to cut this," he started, and then he stopped. I saw his eyes widen slightly, not at me, but at something in the water below that I couldn't see from my angle. At that exact moment, the whispering crowd underneath us rose in volume all at once, like someone had turned a dial. It wasn't just one or two voices anymore. It sounded like a dozen, all overlapping, all whispering fragments of words, some that sounded like my name, some that sounded like my dad's, and some like nonsense. It was so loud and so close that it felt like the deck itself was vibrating with it. The boat gave a weird little lurch to one side, like something heavy had brushed against the hull. Dad scrambled backwards, swearing loudly. As he did, I heard another voice, right by my ear this time, closer than close. It was my own voice, down to the small inflection I have when I'm scared but slightly off, like a bad recording. It whispered one word, sharp and urgent. Jump. It was like someone hissed it directly into my head. That one word carried more pressure than any scream. For a split second, I actually felt my muscles twitch toward the rail, like something in that voice was trying to override my own will. My knees bent as the boat dipped and my foot slid on the wet deck. If my dad hadn't grabbed the front of my jacket at that exact second, I genuinely think I might have gone overboard. He yanked me backwards so hard I landed on my back and the air shot out of my lungs. For a moment, all I could see was the harsh white cone of the deck light and his silhouette leaning over me. The whispering cut off like someone hit a switch. All that was left was the wind and the uneven rumble of the one working motor. My heart hammered in my ears. "We're done," he said, breathless, no argument, no macho bravado. His face looked pale and older in the harsh light. He didn't bother trying to clear the prop anymore. He jumped back to the helm, fired up the good engine, and pointed us straight toward where the GPS said land was. The boat moved strangely, like it was dragging a net or something heavy behind it, but we were at least headed in. The ride back felt like it took years. Every time I forced myself to look over the stern, I half expected to see hands reaching up from the wake or faces breaking the surface. There was nothing visible, just the streak of white foam trailing behind us, glowing faintly under the starlight, but the voices weren't completely gone. Every so often, especially when the motor dipped in RPMs or when we hit a small swell and the prop partly lifted from the water, I'd hear them again, faint but distinct, as if they were clinging to the turbulence in the wake. Sometimes it was my name, stretched and warped. Sometimes it was my dad's. Once I'm almost sure I heard one of them repeat something I'd said earlier that day when we were still joking around, an exact line thrown back at me in a whisper that wasn't mine. I didn't tell him that part. I just sat there, wrapped in my blanket, staring at the GPS distance ticking slowly down, counting the miles until we were back in cell range, back where other people existed. About 10 miles from shore, everything just normalized. The oppressive feeling lifted in a subtle way, like when a headache finally starts to fade. The motor felt less strained, the boat rode easier, the whispers faded into nothing. The radio, which had been silent every time we tried it, suddenly crackled to life with normal chatter, Coast Guard traffic, some fishermen complaining about a net, the regular stuff. My phone buzzed in my pocket with delayed notifications. City lights appeared as a faint orange glow on the horizon. Neither of us said much while we loaded the boat back on the trailer. The marina was quiet again, the same way it had been that morning, but instead of feeling peaceful, it just felt hollow. The sodium lights over the parking lot made the wet asphalt shine like oil. At one point, a breeze made a halyard tap against a mast, and I flinched hard enough that my dad actually looked over at me with concern. The next day, he took the boat to a guy he trusts to check the prop. I went with him mostly because I didn't feel like being alone. The mechanic put the boat up and took a look. On the port side prop and around part of the shaft, there was a tangled mess of something. At first, I thought it was just seaweed and monofilament lines stuck together, but when he started cutting it away, I saw strands of something dark and thick, maybe as long as my forearm, twisted around the metal. It looked like hair, human hair. The mechanic joked about it and said we must have run over a wig or something stupid like that. He tossed some of it into the trash without really looking. I remember staring at the last few strands still clinging to the metal, too dark to be mine, too long to be my dad's, and too smooth and straight to be from some old rope. I had this powerful, irrational urge to snatch it out of his hand and keep it, just to prove later that we hadn't imagined it. I didn't. I just watched him pull it free and drop it in the bin. My dad and I didn't talk about what we'd heard for a long time. Whenever I brought it up in the weeks after, he'd shut it down fast, saying it was just nerves and sound playing tricks on us. But he stopped going that far offshore after that. If we did go out, it was maybe 10 or 15 miles max. He started saying he preferred inshore fishing anyway. I pretended to believe him. A few months later, late one night when I couldn't sleep, I started Googling accidents in that general area of the ocean. I found a couple of news stories about boats that had gone missing near there and a few unexplained maydays where the last transmissions were just static or open mics with weird background noise. None of it proved anything, and I knew I could be connecting dots that didn't belong together. Still, I couldn't shake the idea that whatever we heard that night wasn't unique to us. The part that really keeps me up, though, is something I didn't realize until almost a year afterward. On that cold trip out of boredom, I'd apparently started a voice memo on my phone at some point. I vaguely remember thinking it might be cool to record the sound of the engines and the water for some artsy thing, then forgetting about it. That night, months later, I was clearing space on my phone and found an audio file labeled with the date of the trip. Curious, I put in my earbuds and hit play. At first, it was exactly what you'd expect. The low rumble of the motors, the rushing hiss of water against the hull, and the occasional thump of something shifting on deck. I could hear my dad in the background at one point, laughing about something stupid and my own voice responding. Normal stuff. Then about 10 minutes in, there was a point where the motor noise dropped suddenly, probably when he killed the engines to let us drift. The background sound got very quiet. And under that quiet, so faint I almost missed it, I heard whispering. It wasn't the kind of audio artifact you get from wind. It was layered with multiple voices overlapping, just like I remembered, but the words were hard to make out. I turned the volume up as high as it would go and replayed it over and over. A couple of times I thought I heard my own name in there. Once I thought I heard my dad's. Mostly it was just the impression of language, like hearing a crowded room from far away. Near the end of the recording, the whispers stopped. There was a long pause, just the creak of the boat and a faint shiver of water noise. And then, right before the file cut off, there was a single, clear whisper, much louder than the rest, like someone had leaned right into the microphone. It was my own voice, same pace, same tiny hitch on the first consonant I get when I'm cold, but the tone was wrong, it sounded hungry. "Sarah," it whispered, "listen." I closed out of the file right then and deleted it without listening any further. But even after I erased it, I couldn't shake the feeling that all I'd really done was stop myself from hearing what it was going to say next. That whoever or whatever used my voice that night wasn't finished. And sometimes, when I'm in the shower or standing at the sink with the faucet running, I'll hear a tiny whisper under the water and catch myself leaning in, ready to listen. During the summer, I worked at a remote campground by a river. I was staying in a basement apartment. At first, the noises upstairs seemed normal, until I realized they weren't coming from upstairs. My name is Trevor, and this happened a few years ago in a small backwoods town somewhere in the Midwest. I was 23, trying to save some money between semesters, and a friend of my dad's hooked me up with a job at this family-owned campground out near a wide, slow-moving river. It wasn't a big fancy RV place or anything, more like a faded sign, some beat-up gravel pads, and a lot of trees that turned the road into a tunnel once you turned off the highway. The kind of place you only end up if you're lost or if you already know it's there. The basement apartment came with the job. It was under the owner's house, which sat up on a little rise overlooking the gravel lot and the tree line. My place was half underground with short, wide windows that just peek out at ground level. The inside wasn't awful, just old tan carpet, wood paneling, a tiny kitchen, and a single bedroom. The ceiling creaked a lot, like someone was walking around slowly up there, and at first I assumed it was my boss or his wife. They'd warned me the house was old, so I didn't think much of it. I'd hear footsteps and sometimes a dragging sound, like someone pulling a chair across the floor. The river was really the main attraction. It was a long, lazy-looking thing that wound through miles of dense trees. Locals fished there all the time. Campers would ask me where the good spots were, and I'd point them down a dirt path that led from the back of the campground to a bend in the river where the bank opened up. The first week there, I bought a cheap rod and a little tackle box at Walmart. I grew up fishing with my grandfather on lakes, so it felt like a piece of home. I'd finish checking in the last campers, lock up the office, and walk down that path just as the sun was going down. The first couple of times I went down there, it was peaceful. The water moved slowly and darkly, reflecting the last strips of light between the trees. Bugs buzzed over the surface, and sometimes you'd hear something big splash on the other side, but you never saw what it was. I picked a spot where the dirt bank dipped down near a fallen log, set my little tackle box beside me, and cast my line out into the middle. For a while, nothing happened. Just the quiet sound of the river moving and the distant hum of a generator from someone's RV. I remember thinking I could get used to this. The first time I noticed something was off, it was a couple days later. I was alone at the river, the way I usually was, because most of the campers seemed to pack it in after dark. I baited the hook with a fat nightcrawler, cast out, and watched the bobber drift. I know what it feels like when a fish hits the line. You get that quick tap-tap or steady pull, and the rod tip dips, but that evening I felt nothing. I must have let the line sit there for 10 minutes without even a twitch. When I reeled in to check the bait, my hook wasn't empty. The metal was streaked with bright red, like someone had dragged it through fresh blood. At first I thought maybe I'd snagged a fish and not realized it, or maybe the worm had gotten torn up by something small. But the worm was just gone, not shredded, not half-eaten. Gone. The blood was fresh and thick, hugging the curves of the hook. I remember just staring at it for a second, holding it in front of my face. There wasn't any smell like rotting fish or anything, just that sharp, metallic scent you get if you cut your finger. I rinsed it off in the river, told myself I was overthinking it, and rebaited the hook. It kept happening over the next week. Not every cast, but often enough that it stopped feeling like something I could brush off. I'd throw the line out, feel nothing but the soft pull of the current on the line, and then when I reeled in, there it was again. Sometimes it was just a smear of red along the hook. Sometimes it was a little bead that swelled at the point and then rolled off back into the water. I started checking the line for frays or rust, thinking maybe something was leaching from the metal, but everything looked normal. The river itself seemed normal too, clear near the bank, darker in the middle. No red streaks, no dead fish floating by. Back at the basement apartment, the noises upstairs kept going. Late at night, especially after I came back from the river, I'd lie in bed and listen to slow, measured footsteps packing across the ceiling above me. Once around 1:30 in the morning, I heard what sounded like something heavy being dragged, followed by a dull thud that made the overhead light fixture rattle. The next day, I mentioned it to my boss, Dave, while I was sweeping the little camp store. I asked if he'd been moving furniture around late. He frowned and said, "We sleep on the main level, not upstairs. Nobody really uses the top floor, it's just storage." He said it like he hadn't been up there in a while. That answer stuck with me, but I tried not to dwell on it. When you're alone in a small town with nothing to do, you cling to routines. Mine became work, river, basement, repeat. The fishing should have been the relaxing part, but it got less relaxing every time I pulled up another bloody hook without feeling a single bite. It got to where I'd stare at the line, waiting to see it twitch, straining my eyes through the dim light, but nothing ever happened. The line would stay loose and slack. The bobber would drift lazily. No pull, no fight, no sign anything had touched it, and then the hook would come back wet and red. I tried different bait, corn, artificial lures, and even chicken liver one night. The same thing happened every time. Sometimes the bait would still be there, torn and sagging off the hook with a ring of blood around the curve of the metal. It didn't make sense. I'd fished enough to know that when you hook flesh, you feel it. There's always some kind of resistance. I started to feel watched down there, like someone was standing just behind my shoulder, out of sight, staring at the line with me. One evening just before dark, I noticed something else. I had already reeled in one bloody hook that made my stomach turn, and I decided I was done for the night. As I walked back up the path, the air felt damp and cool. The trees closed in on either side. I kept hearing small noises in the brush, like someone matching their footsteps with mine. When I got back to the gravel lot and walked under one of the streetlights, I looked down at my shoes. Dark spots dotted the sides and tops, like I'd stepped in water deeper than it actually was. My socks were damp. The weird thing was, I hadn't gone in past my ankles. The bank was dry where I'd been standing. The noises in the house changed around that time too. Instead of footsteps, I started hearing a steady, faint sound late at night that took me a while to identify. It sounded like water lapping against wood, a soft, repetitive slosh-slosh, as if there was a pool directly above me and something was moving through it. When I finally asked Dave if there could be a leak or something in the upstairs storage, he gave me this weird look and said, "There's no plumbing up there, Trevor." "Are you sure it's not just the pipes in the wall?" I wanted to say that I knew what pipes sounded like, but I didn't. I just nodded and went back downstairs, feeling stupid and uneasy. The first person to actually say something about the river was a local guy named Mark who worked part-time doing repairs around the campground. He was in his 40s with a sunburned neck and hands that always looked dirty, even when they were clean. One slow afternoon, I mentioned the bloody hook thing like it was a joke, just to see how he'd react. The smile dropped from his face immediately. "Have you been fishing down at the bend?" he asked. I said, "Yeah." He told me people had drowned there before, more than you'd expect for a calm-looking river. "It's deeper there than it looks," he said. "The current grabs your feet. That river takes what it wants." I laughed it off, but he didn't laugh back. He just said, "Don't go down there alone at night. I mean it." Of course, I kept going. Sometimes there'd be a camper or two, but mostly it was just me. I started going later, staying until it was almost fully dark, watching the trees turn into black shapes against the river's surface. The bloody hook became part of the routine. I'd cast, wait, reel in, see the red, curse under my breath, and throw it back. At one point, I got curious and stopped rinsing the hook off right away. I brought one back to the apartment, wrapped in a napkin, and left it on the kitchen counter. A normal drop of blood dries and turns brown pretty fast, but this stayed dark and tacky-looking for hours. When I finally touched it with a paper towel, it smeared like it was still fresh, leaving a red streak on the white napkin. I actually tried to be rational about it. I called the local game warden's office one morning and left a message about possibly contaminated water or an injured animal upriver, something like that. The guy called me back and asked a few questions about dead fish, weird smells, or obvious pollution. There wasn't anything like that. I told him about the blood on the hooks and how I couldn't feel anything biting. He was quiet for a second and then said, "Could just be small fish hitting the bait." You're not always going to feel it. I knew that wasn't what was happening, but what was I supposed to say? I thanked him and hung up, feeling more alone with it than before. The night everything came to head, there was a storm rolling in. The air was heavy and electric. Most of the campers had packed up earlier in the day. Only a couple of RVs were left, and their windows glowed pale yellow in the distance when I headed down the path. The sky over the river was a flat, dark gray. The water itself looked almost black. I stood in my usual spot near the fallen log and cast out, listening to thunder grumble somewhere far away. The first time I reeled in, the hook was wet and red again, the worm gone. I remember saying, "Come on," out loud, more angry than scared. I should have gone back then, but I didn't. I told myself I'd take one last cast and then call it a night. I baited the hook again, set my feet, and threw the line as far as I could. It landed with a soft plop, and the bobber bobbed once, then settled. The air felt even heavier. The woods were dead quiet except for the river. I watched the line, waiting for that familiar slack feeling. Instead, after a minute or two, I felt the tiniest, slowest pull. It wasn't like a fish hitting the bait. It felt more like someone down there had picked up the line between two fingers and was testing it, seeing what I would do. My hand tightened around the rod. I didn't jerk it, didn't reel, just held steady. The pull came again, slightly stronger, and then stopped. When I started to reel in, expecting the same old bloody hook, the resistance on the line was wrong. It wasn't the weight of something fighting. It was a steady, constant pressure, like the other end of the line was tied to something that was slowly backing away. The rod bent, and I had to brace my feet in the soft dirt. For the first time all summer, something felt like it was tugging back at me. The weirdest part was the direction. The line was pointed out toward the middle of the river, but the pull on my body felt like it was coming from somewhere else, slightly off to my left, almost behind me. It was like there were two forces on the line at once, one natural, one not. When I glanced down at the reel, I saw that the line wasn't running straight out from the rod tip anymore. It dipped toward the water, then angled sharply to the side, cutting across the surface toward the bank a few yards downstream, where the trees grew thicker and the mud was darker. The water there bubbled slightly, though nothing was moving. I told myself it was just the current playing tricks with the line. I cranked the reel harder. The pressure increased and the rod bowed more. At that exact moment, I felt something brush the back of my right ankle. A light touch at first, like a piece of weed or fishing line, then it tightened. I looked down and saw my own line wrapped twice around my leg, digging into my sock. It had looped around me somehow, even though I'd been standing still. As whatever was on the other end pulled, the line bit into my skin and started to drag my foot toward the edge of the bank. That was when it clicked for me in a way that made my stomach drop. It didn't feel like I was reeling something in. It felt like I was what was being reeled in. Whoever or whatever was at the other end wasn't trying to take the bait. It was using the bait to take me. I dropped the rod and grabbed at the line around my ankle, trying to pull it loose, but the moment I touched it, the tension doubled. My heels slid in the mud. The edge of the bank crumbled a little, sending dirt sliding down into the water. The river was right there, inches away, black and wide and waiting. I had a pocket knife in my back pocket. My fingers felt numb, but I managed to yank it out and flip the blade open. I saw in that dim, storm-dark light that the line near my ankle was wet and red. Not from my skin, I hadn't been cut deep enough for that yet, but as if it had been dragged through blood somewhere else along its length. The smell of iron hit me, even over the heavy air. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I saw, just for a split second, something pale move under the surface, right where the line entered the water. It wasn't the shape of a fish. I didn't wait to see more. I sawed at the line with the knife as the pulling grew stronger, my toes scraping at the crumbling dirt as my body inched forward. Right before I lost my balance, the line suddenly went tight like a guitar string, humming under my fingers. The sound that came up through it wasn't right. It wasn't the deep vibration of tension. It was lighter, almost like a distant, breathy laugh traveling up through the nylon. The blade finally bit through. The line snapped, whipping back into the river with a sharp hiss. The pressure on my ankle vanished so suddenly that I fell backwards onto my hands, gasping. For a second I just sat there in the wet dirt, my ears ringing from the thunder that finally broke overhead. The rod lay half in the water, the loose line trailing away into the dark. I didn't wait to grab it. I got up and ran. The path back to the campground felt twice as long and 10 times darker. Every branch that brushed my arms felt like fingers. By the time I stumbled into the glow of the streetlight near the house, I was soaking wet with sweat and rain, shaking so hard I could barely get my key into the basement door. Downstairs, the air felt wrong, heavy and damp like the river air had followed me home. I closed and locked the door, then stood there in the middle of the living room, listening. The sound above me wasn't footsteps anymore or the soft lap of water. It was a repeating mechanical click-whir, like the sound of a fishing reel being turned slowly over and over. It was coming from the same spot on the ceiling where I used to hear the dragging. My heart was still racing. I climbed onto the back of the couch to get closer, pressing my ear to the stained ceiling tiles. The sound was definitely right above me. Something small dropped from the ceiling seam then, landing on the cushion next to my hand. It bounced once and came to rest against my fingers. It was one of my hooks, the same brand, same size. I recognized the little notch near the eye where I'd bent it by accident the week before. It was wet. When I picked it up, my fingertips came away red. The hook was bare, with no bait, no worm, and no line attached to it, but there was blood along the curve. The house was silent now. No footsteps, no water, no clicking. Just my own breathing and the distant rumble of thunder moving away. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a chair with the lights on, the hook on the table in front of me on a paper towel, watching it like it might move. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I told Dave I had a family emergency and had to leave. I packed up my stuff, handed over the keys, and was gone by noon. As I was loading my car, he mentioned casually that the last kid who'd stayed in the basement had left early too. He was real into fishing, Dave said, glancing toward the tree line. Spent half his time down at the river, then one day he just didn't show up for his shift. His car was gone, so we figured he'd just taken off. I didn't ask any questions. I drove straight back to the city and stayed with my parents for a while. I threw my rod and tackle box into the back of the garage. For a long time, I couldn't even look at water without feeling my stomach clench. Lakes, rivers, and even deep swimming pools made my skin crawl. You'd think distance and time would make it feel less real, but it hasn't. I still think about the way that line wrapped around my ankle on its own. How I never felt a single bite until the night something decided it was ready to pull. It's been a few years now. I live in an apartment on the third floor of a building surrounded by parking lots and busy streets. The closest natural water is a little creek that's usually half dried up. I've never gone to see it. I don't fish anymore. But sometimes, usually around 2 in the morning, I wake up to a faint sound that makes my heart stop for a second. It's soft, but once you've heard it, you can't mistake it. That quiet click whir of a reel being turned slow and steady, like someone is drawing in a line from very far away. I'll sit up in bed and listen, telling myself it's the heater or pipes or someone upstairs dragging a chair. But I live on the top floor. There is no upstairs. A couple of weeks ago, I finally worked up the nerve to dig out the old tackle box from my closet because I kept thinking about that hook that fell from the ceiling. When I opened it, almost everything inside was dry and dusty, just like it should have been, except for one hook lying in the middle tray. It was clean, with no rust, no dust, just a faint, dark stain along the curve and a single loop of red thread tied neatly through the eye. The thread was the exact color of my favorite shirt hanging in the closet, the one I always wore down by the river. Around the time something knocked from under the ice, I started getting strange notifications from my security camera. The weird part was the camera wasn't even plugged in. I know how that sounds, and if I heard someone else say it, I'd probably roll my eyes a little. But that winter, between the weird alerts on my phone and what happened on the frozen lake, I stopped rolling my eyes at much of anything. That was the last season I ever went ice fishing alone. My name is Alyssa, I'm 27 now, and I live just outside Duluth, Minnesota. Winters here are long and bitter, but I grew up with them. My dad had me out on frozen lakes before I was 10, teaching me how to drill a hole and read the ice. I always felt safe out there. The cold, the empty white, the sound of the wind across the lake, it was peaceful to me. Even as an adult, I'd drive out to one of the smaller lakes by myself on days off and spend hours ice fishing with a thermos of coffee and a little Bluetooth speaker playing quietly next to my bucket. The lake I usually went to that winter was called White Birch Lake. It wasn't some huge tourist spot, just a small, quiet place ringed by trees and a few cabins. Most of the cabins were empty in the winter, and on weekdays I usually had the ice pretty much to myself. The day everything happened, it was late January. The plow had left a ridge of snow at the small parking area, but I had my SUV, and it pushed through just fine. I remember stepping out into the kind of cold that makes your nose sting instantly, seeing my breath hang in the air and just thinking, perfect day, no one's here. Back home, I had this cheap Wi-Fi security camera I kept pointed at my driveway. I bought it during one of those Black Friday deals. It plugged into an outlet inside and pointed out through the front window, so I could see if packages got dropped off or if someone walked up to the front door. A couple of weeks before the lake incident, the camera started acting weird. The app on my phone would keep sending me notifications at random times saying person detected, but when I opened the live feed, it would just be darkness or a blank image. Sometimes it wouldn't connect at all. I got annoyed, unplugged the camera from the wall one night and tossed it on a shelf near the window. I remember seeing the little green light go out. I assumed it was done. But the notifications didn't stop. A few nights after I unplugged it, I woke up around 3 in the morning and saw my phone screen lit up on my nightstand. Person detected 3:12 a.m. I groaned, opened the app, and it just showed the loading circle forever. No image. I closed it and went back to sleep. The next night, it happened again. Person detected 2:47 a.m. I tried again, and this time the image was just pitch black with a kind of grayish blur in one corner that might have been the streetlight. I told myself it was a glitch or some messed up setting still running on the cloud. I didn't think much more about it. If anything, I was more annoyed than scared. The morning I went to White Birch Lake, there had been another notification. I saw it when I grabbed my phone off the charger. Person detected 5:01 a.m. It was still dark outside then. I didn't even open the app. I just cleared the alert, grabbed my thermos, my tackle box, and my auger, and headed out. I remember the sky was that dull gray you only get in winter, like the sun's trying to push through but never fully does. On the drive, the roads were mostly clear, and my favorite podcast was playing in the background. It felt like any other day. When I pulled up to the lake, there were no other cars, no tracks except for a set of older tire marks half buried in snow. I walked out onto the ice with my sled of gear, listening for that familiar sound. Good ice has a certain feel under your boots, solid with only an occasional deep, distant groan as it expands and contracts. I stopped about 100 yards from shore, checked a few spots with my spud bar, then drilled a hole with the auger. Slush came up, then clear water. It looked perfect. I set up my little folding chair, dropped a line, and settled into that quiet I loved so much. At first, it was just like every other trip. A little wind, the faint creak of trees off the shoreline, and the soft click of my reel as I adjusted the line. After maybe 20 minutes, I heard the first knock. It was faint, like someone popped their knuckles under a table. It came from directly under my boots. The ice vibrated just enough that I felt it in my legs. I paused, listened, and then shrugged. Ice makes weird noises all the time. My dad used to joke that if you don't hear at least one good crack, you're not really ice fishing. I went back to watching the line, but then it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was rhythmic and evenly spaced, like someone knocking politely on a door. I felt the vibrations again through the ice into my boots, and this time the sound was a little clearer. It wasn't a sharp crack like ice shifting. It was duller, slower. I stopped breathing for a second and looked down at the small, dark hole in front of me. The water was just a black circle against the white snow. I leaned forward and listened. Nothing, just the wind. I tried to shake it off. I took a sip of coffee, pulled my jacket tighter, and told myself it was just my brain making patterns out of random sounds. I checked my phone. No signal bars, which wasn't unusual out there, but the clock said it was just after 10 a.m. I thought about taking a picture of the empty lake for Instagram, but my fingers were already starting to feel cold, so I put the phone back in my pocket. A couple minutes later, the knocking came again. This time closer to the hole. 3 sharp knocks, a pause, then 2 more. I stood up. The ice under me was clear of snow in a ring around the hole where my boots had shuffled it away. Through the thin layer of cloudy ice, I could see the dark water below. I don't know why I did it, but I knelt down and pressed my gloved hand flat against the ice beside the hole. The cold burned through the glove instantly. I waited. For a moment there was nothing. Then I felt it, another knock, directly against the underside of the ice where my hand was. It made my palm jump. The sound was muffled but close, like someone rapping their knuckles on a table from the underside. I jerked my hand back and sat there, staring. The first thing my brain offered was the idea that a fish had bumped the ice, but fish don't knock in patterns. They don't hit the exact same spot 3 times in a row. I forced myself to lean over the hole and look straight down. The water was dark but not totally black. I could faintly see my line sinking down into it. For a few seconds I just stared, seeing nothing but my own reflection around the edges of the ice. Then, at the very edge of my vision, something moved. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, angling it down toward the hole. The beam cut through the darkness, catching little flecks of ice. For a second, I thought I saw something pale move just below the surface, like a hand withdrawing. I blinked hard. The water was still again, just a circle of blackness with fog creeping around the rim of the hole. I suddenly became aware of how quiet the lake was. No distant cars, no snowmobiles, no other people, just me and whatever had made that sound. The logical part of me kept trying to explain it away. Maybe the ice was thinner above a pocket of water and expanding weirdly. Maybe it was just cracks echoing from another part of the lake. I told myself I was being dramatic. I almost packed up right then, but it felt stupid to leave over some noises. So I forced myself to stay seated, lying back in the water, boots planted firmly, trying to make it through at least another hour so I could feel like I hadn't wasted the trip. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes before the knocking came back. This time it was so loud and so close that it actually made the water in the hole tremble. Knock, knock, knock. I watched tiny ripples hit the edge of the ice, then the knocking changed. Instead of the steady rhythm, it became frantic, like someone pounding with the side of their fist. The sound traveled up through my knees and into my chest. Without thinking, I dropped to my stomach, pressed my face close to the ice, and peered down at the hole with my flashlight aimed straight in. I wish I could say I saw nothing. That would be easier to live with, but I saw a face. It was right there, just below the ice, looking straight up at me through the hole. The skin was this sick, grayish white, like it had been underwater a long time. The hair floated around the head, dark and weightless, fanning out with the slight movement of the water. The eyes were open and wide, impossibly wide, the whites almost glowing in the flashlight beam. The mouth was open too, and I swear I could see it moving, like it was trying to say something, but no sound came through. For a second I was frozen, my breath fogging the ice in tiny bursts. The only things moving were the hair drifting in the water and the slow opening and closing of that mouth. Then one of its hands slid into view, pressing up beneath the ice next to the hole. The fingers were pale and swollen, pressed flat as if they were feeling for an opening. When the fingertips found the edge of the hole, the knocking turned into a full-on slam, as if it was trying to force its way up through that small circle I'd cut in the ice. Something in me snapped. I scrambled back so fast my boots slipped and I fell onto my side. My flashlight skittered across the ice, the beam whipping around wildly. For a split second it landed back on the hole and I saw that pale face again, closer this time, the features distorted by the angle. One eye looked like it was smashed against the underside of the ice. Then there was a single, violent bang that sounded like someone hit the ice with a hammer from below. The sound echoed through the lake. My hearing rang. I grabbed my phone and the nearest piece of gear and just ran. I left most of my stuff there, my chair, my bait bucket, even one of my gloves. I ran across the ice toward the shore without looking back, just listening for more knocks. I didn't hear any, but I also didn't hear anything else. No wind, no creaks, just my own boots pounding and my breath ripping in and out of my throat. By the time I reached the parking area, my lungs burned and my exposed hand was numb. I yanked open my SUV door, threw my gear inside, and sat there gripping the steering wheel with shaking fingers. That's when my phone buzzed again. I looked down, thinking maybe it was a text. It was a notification from the security camera app. Person detected, 11:03 a.m. The thumbnail image was tiny, but I could make out my own front step in something dark in the lower part of the frame. It looked wet, like a shadow puddle or a spill. My heart started pounding again. I had to remind myself that the camera was unplugged. No power. There's no reason it should be sending anything. I told myself it had to be caching old images or something. I put the car in drive and got out of there. On the way home, my phone buzzed again and again. I didn't touch it while I was driving, but it was lighting up the cup holder with each alert. Each time it was the same message. Person detected. By the time I pulled into my driveway, there were at least 6 new notifications from the camera app. My house looked normal. Fresh snow on the front steps, no footprints. The street was empty. I sat in the car for a full minute, engine idling, just staring at the front window where the camera sat dark on the shelf inside. I ended up calling the sheriff's non-emergency line before I even got out of the car. I didn't tell them about the face in the ice. I just said I thought someone might be messing with my property and that my motion camera kept going off even though it was unplugged. 2 deputies came by. One of them checked the perimeter, looking for footprints or any signs of someone being there. The other stood in my living room while I plugged the camera back in, just to show him that the little light was off and that I hadn't been using it. When it powered up, the app finally connected to a live view. It showed the empty driveway and the hood of my SUV. No one was there. The older deputy kind of shrugged and said it was probably a glitch, maybe some bug with the cloud service. His partner asked if I had an ex or anyone who might want to scare me. I told them no. They took down some notes and told me to call again if I saw anything else. Before they left, the younger one hesitated and said, "You should probably stay with friends tonight just in case." That did not make me feel better. After they left, the house felt even emptier. That night I sat on my couch with every light on and decided to go through the stored clips on the camera app. If it was a glitch, I wanted to see what kind. The timeline showed a cluster of events from earlier that day while I'd been on the lake. I tapped the first one. The clip loaded slowly, then finally played. The angle was wrong. The camera was pointed out the window, but the footage didn't show the driveway. Instead, it was like the camera was lower, tilted up slightly. All I could see was the bottom part of the front door and the welcome mat. The image was shaky, like someone holding the camera in their hand. There was also something else. Drops of water streaked across the frame, sliding down slowly, leaving trails. I turned the volume all the way up. At first there was just a faint hiss of static, then I heard a sound in the background. It was muffled and distant, but I recognized it immediately. That same hollow, dull knocking. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. The clip ended. My throat went dry. I checked the camera. It was still sitting on the shelf, plugged in now, facing the driveway exactly like it had before. It hadn't moved. I opened the next clip. This time the camera seemed even closer to the door. More of the frame was filled by the wood and the edges of the mat. The water streaks were thicker now, like someone had just stepped out of a lake and was dripping onto the lens. The knocking was louder in this one. Closer, I could hear it clearly, like someone was pounding on thick wood or ice. Halfway through the clip, something dark slid into the top of the frame. It was only there for a second, but it looked like the edge of a hand, fingers curled. The skin looked pale. I skipped ahead to the last clip on the timeline, the one labeled 11:03 a.m. It took longer to load. When it finally did, the screen was almost entirely taken up by a face. It was pressed right up against the lens from the outside, so close that the features were warped. An eye stared straight into the camera, bloodshot and wide, the pupil blown out, skin pale, wet hair plastered against the glass around it. For a second, the face didn't move at all. Then I saw its mouth open, stretching unnaturally wide, and the entire screen shook with a single deafening bang. The knock was so loud it made me flinch on the couch. The clip cut off right after that. I don't remember deleting the app, but I must have. The next thing I clearly remember is sitting on the edge of my bathtub, splashing water on my face and trying not to throw up. I unplugged the camera again and shoved it into the back of a kitchen drawer. For a couple of nights after that, I slept with the TV on and a lamp by the bed. I didn't go back to White Birch Lake. When my dad asked if I'd been fishing lately, I just told him work had been busy. A few days later, around 3 in the morning, I woke up with that feeling that something had pulled me out of a dream, even though I didn't remember the dream itself. The room was dimly lit by the streetlight outside. I lay there listening. At first, I thought it was just the furnace kicking on. Then I heard it, faint but unmistakable. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from below me, not from the front door, from under the floor. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more, just like on the ice. I told myself it was the house settling, old pipes, whatever. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to slow my breathing. Eventually, the sound stopped. In the morning, I was half convinced I'd imagined it until I picked up my phone to check the time. The security camera app was back on my home screen. I know I deleted it, but there it was like it had never left. There was a red dot on it. I opened it with shaking hands. One notification. Person detected 3:14 a.m. No thumbnail this time, just the little message. I deleted the app again, harder this time, like pushing the icon longer and pressing remove was going to make a difference. I've changed phones since then. I moved the camera from the kitchen drawer to a box in the garage. I stopped ice fishing entirely. Friends ask why, and I tell them I just grew out of it. I don't mention that I still sometimes wake up around 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, listening. Every winter when the cold really sets in, my house starts making those little noises again. The pops and creaks and groans in the walls and floors, most of them I can ignore, but every so often I'll hear that same pattern under the floorboards right beneath my bed. Knock, 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 pause, knock, knock, and without fail my phone screen will light up on the nightstand. No sound, no vibration, just a faint glow and a message waiting in the dark. Person detected. I don't tap it anymore because I'm starting to think the scariest thing won't be seeing what's on the screen, it'll be the night the notification never shows up, and I still hear the knocking anyway. This happened while I was house sitting for my aunt at her lake house for a long weekend. The creaking floors didn't bother me until they started following me. My name's Ryan, and this was last fall at my aunt's place in northern Wisconsin. She has a small A-frame house about 15 minutes outside a town called Eagle Bay, sitting on a hill above a long, foggy lake trail. When she asked me to stay there for a long weekend while she went on a trip with her boyfriend, I jumped at it. I work remotely, I love fishing, and the idea of a quiet few days on a lake in October sounded perfect. I had no idea that the thing that would scare me the most wouldn't be the empty house, but walking that trail in the fog. The house itself was old but cozy, with creaky wooden floors, baseboard heaters, and big windows that looked out over the water. There was a gravel driveway that led down to a dirt road, and from there a narrow trail wound along the edge of the lake for almost a mile. About halfway down that trail there was a small public access point with a makeshift dock and a few aluminum boats that people could rent or leave tied up. My aunt kept an old rowboat chained there that she let me use for fishing. She warned me that fog could roll in fast on the lake this time of year, but I brushed it off. I'd fished in fog plenty of times before. My first night there was uneventful. I made dinner, watched some TV, and listened to the house creak around me as it cooled off. Every time I walked down the hallway, the floorboards popped and complained, but it was almost comforting. I told myself it was just the house settling and the heaters ticking on and off. The next morning, I got up early and walked the trail down to the dock after sunrise. There was a light mist over the water, but nothing too thick. I saw a couple of older guys already out on the lake in a bass boat down by the far shore and waved, and one of them lifted a hand back. It all felt safe and normal. By the second night, I'd gotten into a simple routine. Work on my laptop at the dining table during the day, go for a walk on the trail in the late afternoon, then make dinner and go to bed around midnight. That Friday, though, I checked the weather and saw there was supposed to be a dense fog advisory starting around 3 or 4 in the morning. For whatever reason, that made me want to be out on the water when it happened. I'd never been on a lake when the fog really rolled in thick. It sounded eerie in a cool way, not a dangerous way. So I laid out my gear, tackle box, thermos, small headlamp, and life jacket, and set my phone alarm for 4:00 a.m. When the alarm went off, the house was completely silent except for the baseboard heater clicking and the faint hum of the refrigerator. The darkness felt heavier than usual, like the windows were just black mirrors. I got dressed, pulled on my hoodie and jacket, and stepped out into the hallway. The old floorboards groaned under my weight as I walked to the front door, each step making a small, complaining creak. It was the kind of sound that would normally bug me in an apartment, but out there it just reminded me I wasn't completely alone. I grabbed my rod and bag, slipped on my boots, and stepped out into the cold. The air slapped me in the face. It was colder than I expected, that raw kind of chill you only get right before sunrise in late October. My breath came out in white clouds immediately. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I could already see the fog down by the water, a white band slowly crawling up from the lake. I turned on my headlamp, locked the front door, and started down the gravel driveway. The crunch of rock under my boots was oddly loud. By the time I reached the dirt road and stepped onto the lake trail, the fog was low around my ankles, rolling over the ground like it was alive. The trail was familiar from my daytime walks, but it felt totally different in the dark. Trees loomed over me on the inland side, their branches lost in the black sky, and on the other side was the slope down to the water. My headlamp beam cut through maybe 10 to 15 feet ahead, and everything beyond that was just gray nothing. The only sounds were my footsteps, the occasional drip of moisture from the trees, and faint, distant lapping from the lake. I kept telling myself this was exactly what I wanted: creepy atmosphere, cold air, just me and the water. Underneath that thought, though, there was a tight, nervous feeling in my chest that I tried to ignore. When I reached the public access area, the fog was already thicker. It crawled over the dock and around the aluminum boats tied to it, blurring their edges and making them look like shapes in an old photograph. I unclipped my aunt's rowboat from the chain, eased it into the water, and climbed in, careful not to rock it too much. As I pushed off from the dock and started to row, the shore quickly faded into gray. The beam from my headlamp just bounced off the fog after a few yards, so I switched it off and let my eyes adjust to the dimness. All I could see were vague shadows of trees on the far shore and a pale, glowing sky just starting to hint at sunrise behind the clouds. For a while it was peaceful. I dropped anchor in what I guessed was the shallower side of the lake and cast my line. The water was so calm that every small movement sounded amplified, the plunk of the lure hitting the surface, the ticking of the reel, and the tiny slaps as something small broke the water somewhere out in the fog. Time got weird out there. I checked my phone once and saw it was 4:37 a.m., then put it away and tried to focus on fishing. I thought I heard a distant motor at one point, like someone far off starting up a boat, but the sound faded almost as soon as I noticed it. The fog thickened until I could barely see the tip of my rod. After maybe 45 minutes of catching nothing but cold air, the piece started to feel less peaceful and more like I was floating inside a blank, empty world. I couldn't see the shore. I couldn't see any other boats. The fog muffled everything so much that even my own little movements sounded wrong, like they were happening in someone else's ears. At one point I thought I heard a splash, a big one, like something heavy hitting the water a ways behind me, but when I turned the boat there was nothing there, just gray. That tight feeling in my chest grew, and I finally decided I'd had enough. It wasn't fun anymore. The problem with rowing back in fog is that there's no sense of direction. I didn't have a compass, just my phone's map, and that wasn't much help on a small lake with no clear landmarks. I had a rough idea of where the dock was based on the way I'd been drifting, so I lifted the anchor, set my phone in the cup holder, and started rowing in what I hoped was the right direction. Every few strokes, I'd stop and listen, trying to hear the shore. Sometimes I thought I heard water lapping against rocks, sometimes I thought I heard nothing at all. Then faintly I picked up another sound, a soft, rhythmic scraping, like something being pulled over damp ground. I told myself it was just my imagination and kept rowing. Eventually the fog ahead of me shifted slightly, and I saw the dark shape of trees rising out of it. I made it to shore, but as I let the boat drift closer, I realized something was off. The slope down to the water here was steeper than near the access point, and there was no dock, just a narrow strip of muddy bank lined with reeds. I had overshot the dock by a decent distance, probably closer to the far end of the lake where the trail curved around. Still, land was land. I nosed the boat into the mud, tied it loosely to a branch, grabbed my gear, and climbed up toward where I knew the trail had to be. The trail here was narrower and slightly more overgrown. The fog hugged the ground like a blanket, swirling thickly around my boots as I walked. My headlamp made the air in front of me look like a solid wall. I turned it down to its lowest setting and kept moving, following the faint, darker line of the path through the gray. That was when I heard it again, the scraping sound I'd noticed out on the lake. Only now it was clearer and it wasn't behind me. It was ahead, somewhere up the trail. It sounded like something heavy being dragged over gravel in slow, steady pulls. Drag, pause, drag, pause. At first I assumed it was someone hauling a big cooler or a small boat on a dolly back toward their truck. People did dawn fishing all the time on that lake. It wasn't that weird. Then I saw a shape forming in the fog, a darker silhouette moving in the same direction I was headed, maybe 50 yards up the path. As I walked slowly, the shape resolved into a tall figure, definitely a person, wearing what looked like a long coat or maybe a rain slicker that hung down past their knees. They had something behind them that stretched out along the trail, a long, low shape that bumped and scraped along the ground as they pulled it. That was the catch, I thought, probably a giant fish in a net or some kind of game animal. But the closer I got, the less that made sense. The thing being dragged wasn't moving like dead weight. Every so often it would jerk slightly out of rhythm with the pull, like it was trying to resist. I slowed down without quite meaning to, my heart rate picking up. The person ahead of me didn't seem to notice I was there, or at least they didn't look back. Their movements were slow and methodical, like they'd been doing this for hours. The dragging sound was getting under my skin now, the way fingernails on a chalkboard might. Drag, pause, drag, pause. Then, as I watched, the long shape jerked harder, and I heard a sound carried faintly back through the fog, a muffled, desperate noise that could have been a voice. Instinct kicked in. I stepped off the trail to the right, into the damp leaves and underbrush, crouching down behind a cluster of young pines. Branches scratched my jacket as I pushed through, and I tried to control my breathing, suddenly terrified of how loud it sounded inside my own head. From my spot a few feet off the path, I could see the figure more clearly as they drew closer. The person was wearing a dark green rain slicker and a pair of high waders, the kind serious fishermen use, with a hood pulled low and a brimmed hat over it. Their head hung at a slight angle, like their neck was crooked, and they didn't swing their arms normally when they walked. In one hand, I could see a thick rope running back to the thing they were dragging. The catch was wrapped in something dark, maybe a tarp or netting, that was cinched tight around the middle. It was about the size of a person curled up. As the figure passed within about 15 or 20 feet of my hiding spot, the bundle twitched again. I saw what looked disturbingly like a foot press against the inside of the tarp for a second, straining outward before the rope jerked hard and it went still. The muffled noise came again, just once, like someone trying to scream with their mouth covered. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a fish. This wasn't an animal someone was hauling back from a hunt. This was a person. The fisherman stopped, not all at once, but gradually, like his body took a second to register the idea of stopping. He stood there on the trail, the rope taut in his hand, the bundle resting against the gravel. Then very slowly he lifted his head. I couldn't see his face, not clearly. It was shadowed by the hat brim and the hood, but I had the horrible sensation that he was smelling the air like an animal. I held my breath until my lungs burned. The only sound was the faint creaking of the nearby trees and that soft, wet breathing coming from under his hat. It sounded wrong, like someone inhaling through a chest full of water. For a long moment he didn't move. Then the bundle on the ground twitched again, just slightly, like whoever was in there was trying one last time to get free. The fisherman responded by giving the rope a short, vicious jerk, hard enough to lift the bundle off the ground for a second before it hit the gravel with another dull thump. The movement knocked something loose from the outside. A corner of the tarp or blanket slid away just enough for me to see pale skin and what looked like a bare ankle before the fabric settled back. I bit down on my tongue to keep from making a sound. I remember thinking over and over, do something, call out, run, anything, but my body didn't listen. That was when my phone betrayed me. Even though I had it on silent, I'd forgotten to turn off vibration. The notification buzzed in my pocket and lit up the fabric just enough to cast a faint glow through my jacket. It might as well have been a flare. I felt the blood drain from my face. The fisherman's head snapped toward my side of the trail. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel his attention like a physical weight. He took one step off the path in my direction, dragging the bundle a few inches closer, the rope scraping over the ground. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but I stayed frozen, clenching my jaw so hard it hurt. Somewhere far behind us, up near the road, a car door slammed. It was faint, but it cut through the fog like a gunshot. The fisherman stopped mid-step. For a second, it was like he was trying to decide whether to keep moving toward me or deal with whatever was happening up the trail. There was a long, horrible pause, then he turned away. Without a word, he stepped back onto the path, pulled hard on the rope, and started dragging the bundle again, this time angling off onto a narrower side path that I hadn't even noticed before. It led down toward the water between the trees. The dragging sound grew softer and softer until it blended back into the normal noises of the lake, and then it was gone. I stayed crouched there for what felt like 10 minutes, but it was probably less than one. When I finally forced myself to move, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I stumbled back onto the trail, glanced in the direction he'd gone, and immediately wished I hadn't. The fog was thinner there, and I could see the faint impression of deep boot prints leading into the trees and a long, smudged track where the bundle had been pulled through the gravel and dirt. There was a darker patch smeared here and there along it that could have been mud or could have been something else. I turned and nearly ran back the way I'd come, my rod banging against my shoulder and my tackle box clacking with every step. By the time I got back to my aunt's driveway, my lungs were burning. The house loomed up through the fog like a shadow. I kept looking over my shoulder as I went up the gravel, half expecting to see that tall silhouette coming up behind me with something dragging along the ground. When I reached the front door, I fumbled the keys twice before getting it open. The floorboards groaned under me as I stepped inside and slammed the lock, and for the first time since arriving, the sound didn't comfort me. It just reminded me of something, echoing footsteps. I grabbed the house phone instead of my cell, hands shaking, and dialed 911. The dispatcher kept her voice calm as I tried to explain what I'd seen, that there was a man on the trail dragging what looked like a bound person toward the water. When the sheriff's deputy showed up about 20 minutes later, the fog had gotten even thicker outside. He was middle-aged and tired-looking, with a mustache and a heavy jacket. I walked him down the trail to where I'd come out of the woods. The drag marks were still faintly visible, along with some of the deeper boot prints, though the damp air was already starting to soften them. The deputy crouched down, touched one of the marks, and then stood up again. "Could be a deer," he said. "People haul them like this sometimes. Are you sure you didn't see antlers or anything?" I told him I was sure. I told him about the ankle and the muffled sound. He looked at me for a long second, then said, "We'll have a look around." They searched for about an hour, 2 deputies and 1 local officer, splitting up along the trail and down toward the water. I stayed near the access point, feeling useless and sick. Eventually, one of them came back and told me they hadn't found anything. No tarp, no rope, no body. The drag marks disappeared near a muddy spot that could have led into the lake, and any footprints near the water's edge were just impressions in soft, wet sand. "If something happened," the deputy said, "the lake might have taken whatever it was, or it might just be nothing. You said it was real foggy." There was no accusation in his voice, but I could tell he thought the darkness and fog had gotten to me. They took my statement anyway and drove off, their tail lights vanishing into the gray. I tried to convince myself they were right. I tried to act normal. I made coffee, sat at the table, and stared out at the invisible lake. As the day went on and the fog finally lifted, I walked back down the trail by myself. The drag mark was almost gone now, just a faint disturbance in the gravel if you knew where to look. I followed it to where it had started to veer off toward the water and stopped. The side path the fisherman had taken looked less like a trail and more like a narrow gap between trees, leading down to blackberry thorns and black mud. I didn't go any farther. Instead, I went back to the house and tried to sleep that night. That was when the creaking floors stopped being background noise. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't the heater or the fridge or the wind outside. It was the slow, deliberate creak of someone walking across the living room floor. One step, pause, another step, pause. The pattern was too careful to be the house settling. I lay in bed, holding my breath, counting each creak as it moved from the direction of the front door toward the hallway. There was a long stretch of silence, then one more creak, closer this time, like someone had shifted their weight just outside my bedroom door. I stared at the thin line of light at the bottom of the door and saw a shadow break it, just for a second, like something had passed by. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen on my back, eyes wide open. Eventually there were no more sounds, no turning doorknob, no footsteps retreating, nothing. I didn't sleep again that night. When the first gray light of morning seeped through the curtains, I finally got up. My heart was pounding as I opened the bedroom door. The hallway was empty, and the living room looked exactly the same as it had before I went to bed. The only difference was out on the back deck. On the weathered boards just in front of the sliding glass door, there was a single, clear, wet boot print. It was larger than my boot by at least 2 sizes and faced directly toward the glass, like someone had walked up and stood there, looking in. It was half overlapping my own older muddy prints from earlier in the day. I called the sheriff's office again. This time, a younger officer came out, took a look at the print, and shrugged. "Could have been one of the guys from this morning," he said. "Might have walked around back, checked the doors, hard to tell." I knew none of them had gone around to the back, but I didn't argue. There wasn't much point. They had no body, no missing person report, nothing but the word of a guy who'd been out on a foggy lake at 4 in the morning. My aunt got back the next day and could tell something was wrong as soon as she saw me. I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time, then said she'd install some motion sensor lights and a cheap trail camera by the edge of the yard where the trail came closest. I left that afternoon and was glad to watch the lake and the fog disappear in the rearview mirror. A couple of weeks later, back at my apartment, I got a small padded envelope in the mail from my aunt. Inside was an SD card and a sticky note that said, "You'll want to see this. I'm thinking about selling the place." I plugged the card into my laptop and opened the folder of images. Most of them were boring, deer-nose close-ups, raccoons, and a couple of neighborhood kids cutting along the trail during the day. Then I found a series of grainy, gray images from the night before the morning I went fishing in the fog. They were time-stamped between 3:50 and 4:10 a.m. In one of them, I saw myself clearly, head down, rod in one hand, tackle bag over my shoulder, walking along the trail past the edge of the yard toward the dock. In the next photo, taken maybe 10 seconds later, I was farther along the trail, almost out of frame. Behind me, about 20 feet back, there was another figure, tall in a long coat or slicker, the outline of a hat barely visible through the fog. The image was grainy, but you could see that something long and narrow trailed behind him along the ground. The angle made it impossible to tell what it was, just a darker smear against the lighter gravel. I sat there staring at that picture for a long time. The timestamp said 3:58 a.m. before I ever pushed off in the boat. He hadn't just appeared out of nowhere on the trail when I was heading back. He'd been behind me the whole time, walking the same route, staying just far enough back to keep out of my light. A month or so after all this, I saw a short article online about a missing hiker from a neighboring county. The last place his phone had pinged was somewhere near the Eagle Bay area. Nobody had been found. No sign of foul play, the article would admit to, just ongoing investigation. I don't know if it was connected to what I saw. I don't know if the bundle the fisherman was dragging was that guy or someone else, or if the lake kept its secrets. I haven't been back to my aunt's place, and she did end up putting it on the market that winter. I still fish sometimes, but only from busy piers in broad daylight with people all around. Every now and then, usually on early foggy mornings when I'm driving to work and the mist hangs low over the road, I hear that sound again in my head. Drag, pause, I see that single wet boot print on the deck facing the glass, and I think about the photo of me on that trail with the tall figure behind me and the long shape trailing in the fog like a second shadow. The scariest part isn't that I saw him once. It's knowing that, for at least a little while that night, he saw me first and decided to let me keep walking. I used to take late-night walks during that summer I spent noodling for catfish on the river. One night, I realized someone else had been walking the exact same route as me for weeks. My name is Hunter, and I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma where there really isn't much to do besides drink, fish, or drive around back roads. My dad taught me how to noodle when I was a teenager. For anyone who does know, that's when you wade into the river, feel around for catfish holes with your hands, and let the fish bite onto you so you can drag them out. It sounds insane, but where I'm from, it's just something people do. By the time this happened, I was 22 and way too comfortable with that river. There was one stretch of riverbank that felt like my spot. It was about 15 minutes outside of town, down a narrow dirt road that most people didn't bother with unless they already knew it was there. At the end of the road, there was a little clearing where you could park a truck and walk down to a bend in the river. The bank there was muddy and sloped, with tree roots sticking out and these little undercuts in the bank where big catfish like to hide. I'd go out there in the afternoons to noodle with friends, and later at night, I'd sometimes go back alone just to walk along the bank, think, and smoke. Those late-night walks started as a way to clear my head. I'd park my truck, leave the headlights off, and just walk along the narrow path that followed the river. There was usually a little bit of moonlight reflecting off the water, and the only sounds would be insects, frogs, and the occasional splash from a fish. I knew every turn in that trail, every low-hanging branch I had to duck, and every root that stuck up just enough to trip you if you forgot it was there. I never really worried about people being out there. It felt like my own private place. The first time I noticed the footprints, I didn't think anything of it. There's a strip of wet sand and mud right along the waterline, and sometimes I'd walk barefoot there to cool my feet off. One night I came back the next day and saw a line of bare footprints in the exact place I remembered walking. Same general size, same path. I just assumed they were mine from the night before, still visible because it hadn't rained. But a week or so later, I started to notice something that didn't make sense. I'd walk the same route at night, then come back the next afternoon to noodle with my buddy Luke. While we were setting up, I'd find two sets of prints in the wet strip of sand. One set was clearly mine from when I'd come out alone the day before. The other set was just slightly off to the side. Step by step, it followed the same path. It looked like someone had walked right next to where my feet had been, almost overlapping them. The weird part was, I only ever remembered walking alone. At first I told myself it had to be a coincidence, or maybe my brain was just mixing up old prints. The riverbank gets a lot of marks from animals, people fishing, stuff like that, but then I started actually paying attention. I noticed that wherever my prints started, the other set started around the same spot. Wherever I turned around, those prints turned around too. And every time they were just close enough that if someone had really been beside me, our shoulders would have almost brushed. The toes on the other prints looked off too. They were longer, like each toe dug in deeper than it should have. Around that same time, I started getting really into a spot we called the tunnel. It was this undercut section of the bank where the river had eaten away a big hollow space under the mud and tree roots. You couldn't see the entrance from above. You had to be in the water, feeling along the bank with your hands until you found it. The hole went back farther than my arm could reach. I'd pulled a couple of big flatheads out of there over the years, and it became kind of a challenge between me and Luke to see who could get the next monster out of that tunnel. People joked about snapping turtles and snakes being in there, but I'd never felt anything that wasn't a fish. The first time that changed, it was subtle. I was waist deep in the water, leaning into the bank with one arm submerged, feeling around the opening of the tunnel. The water was murky and warm, and I could feel the rough texture of the bank, the smoothness of the hole's entrance, and little bits of debris. I was sweeping my hand back and forth when something brushed my fingers. It wasn't a catfish. It felt smooth and cold, like the underside of a frog's belly, but much bigger. It slid along my hand for a second, then was gone. I yanked my arm back instinctively. Luke laughed and told me I probably just touched a carp or a log. I tried to laugh too, but it bothered me more than I admitted. My night walk started feeling different after that. The silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like the river was listening. One night, as I walked along the path, I heard a large splash ahead of me, close to the bend where the tunnel was. It wasn't the random plop of a fish. This sounded heavier, like something big slipping off the bank into the water. When I got closer, my phone flashlight swept over the sand and stopped on a set of marks leading from the water up to the path. They weren't footprints exactly. They looked like drag lines, as if something had been pulled or had pulled itself up the bank. Whatever made them had long, finger-like grooves that dug deep into the mud, spaced wider apart than any human hand. I told myself it was probably just someone dragging a cooler or a net, but there was no sign of anything else around. No tire tracks, no cans, no signs of a campfire, just those long marks in the smooth, dark surface of the river a few feet away. That night, I cut my walk shorter than usual. I drove home with the windows up, feeling stupid for being scared of mud. A few days later, I went back alone in the late afternoon to hit the tunnel again. Luke had to work late, and I didn't feel like waiting for him. The air was thick and humid, and the river level was a little lower than usual, which made the undercut more exposed. I parked in my usual spot, waded in with my old sneakers on, and made my way down to the tunnel. There was no one else out there. No other cars on the dirt road, no voices from the opposite bank, nothing. It was just me, the water, and the constant buzzing of cicadas in the trees. I eased myself into the deeper part by the tunnel, where the water came up to my chest. I leaned my shoulder into the cool mud of the bank and slid my right arm under the surface, feeling along the familiar spot where the opening should be. The water was cloudy, so everything was by touch. My fingers found the lip of the hole, then the hollow space behind it. I went deeper, feeling around for the wide mouth and rough lips of a catfish. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then something wrapped around my wrist. It happened so fast I didn't even have time to process it at first. 1 second, my hand was feeling around in muddy water, and the next, something clamped down and pulled. It wasn't a bite, there were no teeth. It felt like a hand, not a human one. The fingers, if that's what they were too long. They curled around my wrist and part of my forearm in one motion with a grip that felt impossibly strong and icy cold. The skin felt smooth and rubbery, like wet latex. My instinct was to yank back, but whatever had hold of me jerked me forward, dragging my upper body toward the hole. My shoulder slammed into the bank. I sucked in a mouthful of air right before my face went under. My chest hit the water, my feet left the bottom for a second, and suddenly my whole arm was being pulled into the tunnel. I jammed my left hand against the outside of the bank, trying to get leverage, but the mud was slick. The pressure on my right wrist increased, and I felt myself sliding deeper. My head went under, and cold, dirty water flooded my nose and ears. Everything went muffled. I couldn't see anything, just brownish darkness. Then I felt the second hand. It latched higher up, just below my elbow. Same slick, rubbery skin. Same 2 long fingers wrapping almost all the way around my arm. It squeezed so hard I felt bones grind. It was pulling me deeper into the tunnel where the space was too tight for my body. My shoulder jammed painfully against the top of the opening. For a split second, I realized something. This thing didn't care I was stuck. It was still trying to drag me in, even if it meant tearing me apart on the way. Panic hit me full force. I kicked wildly, trying to find the river bottom, but my feet kept slipping on the sloped mud. I felt one of my sneakers get sucked off. My lungs screamed as the last of my air burned out. I pushed my left hand deeper into the mud outside the hole, nails clawing at roots and rocks. I managed to hook 2 fingers around a thick root and pulled with everything I had. Whatever had my arm pulled back just as hard. For a horrible second, I was stretched between the 2 forces, shoulder popping, chest heaving, and head pounding. As I thrashed, my fingertips brushed against something hard and sharp lodged in the mud near the root. It felt like broken glass or metal. I grabbed it without thinking and sliced it backward across whatever was gripping me. Underwater, I didn't hear a scream, but I felt the reaction. Both hands on my arm convulsed at once, fingers tightening to the point of pain, then ripping away from my skin. The sudden release sent me flying backward out of the hole. My head cracked against something, and I shot up to the surface, coughing and choking. I stumbled and slipped my way to the shallows, half running, half crawling until my knees hit sand. I looked down at my arm. There were deep red marks wrapped around my wrist and forearm, already swelling into bruises that clearly looked like finger marks. Not 5 fingers though, more like 4, but longer, each one leaving an oval-shaped bruise that overlapped the others. The second hand had left similar marks higher up. Some of them were punctured where that sharp object had cut into it along with my skin. I was bleeding, but all I could think about was what might still be in that tunnel behind me. I forced myself to look at the water. For a few seconds there was nothing but ripples and little circles where my blood dripped in. Then near the tunnel entrance I saw the surface bulge upward like something was pushing against it from below. Not like a fish, not a quick flick and splash. This was slower and heavier, like something rising just enough to break the tension of the water before sinking back down. In that brief swelling of the surface, I saw a pale shape just under it. It looked like part of a forearm and a hand, the fingers spread wide, tapering into the darkness of the tunnel. The skin was an unnatural grayish-white, almost translucent. Right where I'd cut it, I thought I saw something darker drifting away in the water like a thin cloud, then it was gone. I don't remember getting out of the river. I just remember suddenly being at my truck, soaking wet, shaking so hard that I dropped my keys twice before I got the door open. Driving home was a blur. At some point I must have called my mom because she met me in the driveway and insisted on taking me to the ER. The nurse and doctor seemed more annoyed than concerned. They cleaned the cuts, checked my shoulder, and told me I was lucky I hadn't drowned. When I tried to explain that something grabbed me, the doctor just nodded and said, "Those undercut banks have all kinds of roots and debris. Your mind plays tricks when you're underwater and panicking." What bothered me most was when the doctor examined the bruises and hesitated just long enough for me to notice. He traced one of the marks on my wrist with his finger and said, almost to himself, "These look almost like handprints." Then he caught my eye and shrugged it off, saying it was probably from me grabbing onto roots and rocks. They put it in the report as a near drowning due to entrapment in underwater debris. No one really wanted to hear anything else. A couple days later, a game warden showed up at our house. We'd gotten a copy of the hospital report, I guess. He asked a few basic questions about where I'd been noodling, how deep the water was, and that sort of thing. His tone was casual, but he kept circling back to the exact location, asking me to describe the bend, the trees, and the shape of the bank. When I told him about the tunnel, he paused for a second and said, "You know, a kid went missing down on that stretch a few years back, right?" We never found him. Folks figured he got caught under a log jam or something. That current can pull you under fast. He said it like a warning, but the way he avoided looking me in the eyes made my skin crawl. I promised everyone I wouldn't go back down there, and for a while I didn't, but curiosity eats at you. After about a month, once the bruises had faded to yellow and green, I convinced Luke to drive out there with me in broad daylight so I could show him where it happened. We both told ourselves we were just going to look, not get in the water. When we pulled up, everything looked the same bend in the river, the same muddy bank, the same narrow path worn into the grass. But as we walked down toward the water, I could tell the river level had dropped a bit since that day. From higher up on the bank, we could actually see part of the tunnel's entrance now, a dark, low opening under the shelf of mud. The sand at the waterline was smoother than usual, like it had been disturbed recently. As we stepped closer, Luke pointed at the ground and said, "Dude, check this out." There were footprints again. One set looked like regular bare human prints, mine, probably from before the incident. The other set right next to them was half in and half out of the water, like someone had been walking with 1 foot on land and 1 foot in the river. The toes on those prints were spread wider and longer, digging deeper trenches in the mud. They followed the same path as mine, step for step, then disappeared where the sand turned to harder ground. Luke tried to play it off as some deformed guy messing with us, but he didn't sound convinced. As we turned to leave, he stopped and reached down near the bank, pulling something half buried out of the mud. It was my old GoPro, the one I thought I'd lost earlier that summer when it slipped off my head mount during a noodling trip. The casing was scratched and the strap was broken, but it was definitely mine. We both got quiet. I realized the camera must have been sitting near that tunnel the whole time, just a few feet from where I almost got pulled under forever. Later that night at home, I cleaned the GoPro up and plugged it in. Somehow it still turned on. There were a few old clips from fishing and messing around, and one video file that didn't have a timestamp like the others. It was just a blank name with a date that didn't make sense, as if the camera had reset itself. When I opened it, the footage was dark and grainy, but I could tell it was shot from about chest height, pointed at the path along the riverbank. The weird thing was, I didn't remember filming it. It showed someone walking my usual route at night. You could hear the insects and the river and the sound of breathing, my breathing. I recognized the little huff I do when I walk uphill. A few minutes into the footage, something appeared behind me on the path. At first it was just movement, a shape darker than the trees. Then as the camera bounced along, there were brief glimpses of something tall and thin walking just at the edge of the frame, always at the waterline. It moved in this strange, fluid way, like it was more comfortable in water than on land. Once or twice, when the camera swung a certain way, I thought I saw a long, pale arm hanging too low, almost reaching the ground, fingers nearly touching the surface of the river. Every time I paused the video to get a better look, the shape blurred into shadows and branches. But the one thing that stayed clear over and over was that it was always right beside me, matching my pace, walking the same route. I deleted the video. I told myself it was just some glitch, some weird artifact from the water damage, but deep down I knew what I'd seen. I moved away from that town not long after, and I haven't been back to that river since. I don't noodle anymore. I barely even swim in lakes now. I thought putting distance between me and that bend in the river would be enough. But a couple weeks ago, something happened that made me realize maybe distance doesn't matter. I live in a small rental house now, hundreds of miles from that river, in a neighborhood with no real bodies of water nearby except a drainage ditch down the road. One night I checked my phone before bed and saw a notification from my health app. It said, "Evening walk detected 1.2 miles along usual route." The problem was, I hadn't gone for a walk that night. I opened the map attached to the notification. The route it showed wasn't any street near my house. It was a narrow, snaking line along a body of water, with a little loop at the end where the path turned back on itself. Even in the simplified map view, I recognized the shape. It was the bend of that river back home. I don't know how that data got on my phone. I don't know if it was some glitch pulling old information from years ago. All I know is that the timestamp on it matched the exact time I'd woken up suddenly that night, heart racing, feeling like someone was walking slowly past my bedroom window. I lay there in the dark, holding my breath, listening. I heard nothing. But I couldn't shake this image of long, pale fingers dragging along the siding of my house like they once dragged through the mud of that riverbank. I haven't taken a walk at night since. And when people ask why I don't go back home to visit the river I grew up on, I don't tell them about the thing that grabbed me in that catfish tunnel. I just tell them I'm more of an indoors person now. But every time my phone buzzes with a random notification, there's a part of me that's terrified to look, because I'm scared I'll see that same route again and know that whatever was walking beside me that summer never really stopped. My roommate traveled a lot for work around the time of what happened at the lake that returned the dead. So when I heard him talking in his room at 3 a.m., I knew something was wrong. He wasn't home. This was 2 summers ago when I was 24 and living in a rundown apartment outside Albany, New York. I worked a 9-to-5 office job. My roommate Matt was a traveling sales rep, usually gone Monday through Friday. Our place was small, thin walls, a creaky hallway, and beige carpet that always felt a little damp, but it was cheap, and that was enough for us. The whole thing started because of a coworker named Jason. One Friday at work, he invited me, our coworker Emily, and his friend Tyler to spend the weekend at his grandparents' old campground on a lake about 90 minutes away. It had been closed for years, he said, but we could still use the land. No neighbors, no kids, just us and the water, he promised. I was exhausted from work and thought a quiet trip away from everything sounded perfect. On the drive out, Jason mentioned that locals called it the lake that keeps what it takes. He said it like a joke, but he added that more people had drowned there than made sense, swimmers who vanished, boats flipping on calm days. Tyler laughed and said every small town had a haunted story. I laughed too, but the phrase stuck in the back of my head and wouldn't leave. The campground itself looked abandoned when we pulled in. The wooden entrance sign was faded and hanging by one rusted chain. Weeds pushed up through cracked gravel. The numbered posts for the campsites leaned at weird angles or were snapped off completely. An old cinder-block bathhouse near the entrance had its windows boarded over and graffiti on one side. It felt less like a place for families and more like somewhere people had walked away from in a hurry. The lake sat behind a line of pines, dark and quiet, tall trees crowded right up to the shoreline. Off to the left, a narrow wooden dock stretched out over the water, sagging in the middle, missing a board near the end. Even in daylight, the water was so dark you couldn't see more than a few inches down. Its surface barely moved. It looked less like something alive and more like a flat piece of black glass. We set up our tents near the shore and got a fire going. For a while it felt normal, music from a Bluetooth speaker, cheap beer, and Jason telling old stories about his grandparents' campground. As the sky turned orange and then blue, he asked if anyone wanted to try fishing from the dock. Emily chose to stay by the fire. Tyler said he was too drunk to stand on old wood over deep water, so it ended up just Jason and me walking down the narrow dirt path toward the lake. Up close, the dock felt like it might fall apart any second. Some boards bowed under our weight, and the whole thing creaked with every step. Jason handed me a spare rod tied on a bobber, and we cast our lines. The little red and white floats landed a short distance out and settled in the still water. For a few minutes we just stood there in silence, listening to insects and the faint pop of the fire behind us. Then Jason's phone buzzed. He swore under his breath and said it was his girlfriend, then walked back toward the start of the dock to take the call. That left me alone at the far end. My bobber was a tiny dot in the dark water. The sky deepened to navy, and the trees on the far side of the lake turned into one solid black shape. The only light came from Jason's flashlight behind me and a thin strip of moon. After a minute or two, my bobber dipped once and popped back up. Normally I would have been excited, but instead my chest tightened. I stared at it, waiting for it to move again. That's when I saw something pale just under the surface next to it. At first it was only a blurred shape that might have been a reflection or a piece of trash. Then it rose, straight up, slow and steady, as if something was pushing it from below. The water around it barely stirred. When it broke the surface, I forgot how to breathe. It was a hand. A human hand coming out of that perfectly still lake, inches from my bobber. The skin was gray-white and wrinkled, like it had been soaking for a long time. Droplets slid down the fingers as the wrist and part of the forearm rose into view. There was no splashing, no struggle. The arm just lifted, vertical and controlled, from deep water that was supposed to be too deep for someone to stand in. My mind scrambled for explanations. A mannequin arm, some kind of prank with a glove on a stick. But even at that distance I could see details you don't see on plastic. The folds in the knuckles, the faint blue tint near the nails, and then the fingers moved. Slowly they curled inward and then spread back out, over and over, in a slow, calm rhythm. It took me a second to realize what it was doing. The hand was waving at me. That simple motion bothered me more than anything. It wasn't frantic like someone drowning. It was casual, almost friendly, like someone recognizing you in a crowd. I stood there frozen, rod slack in my hands, watching this pale hand greet me from a dead quiet lake. That's when I noticed the ring, a simple silver band on the ring finger, catching the last faint light. For some reason, that detail made it feel horribly personal. Whoever this had been, they were real once. "Jason," I tried to say, but it came out as a croak. The hand kept waving. "Jason," I shouted louder, still staring at the water. I heard his footsteps pounding down the dock behind me, boards protesting under his weight. The second I glanced back to see how close he was and looked back at the lake again, the hand was gone. The bobber floated where it had been. The water around it was flat and black. No ripples spread outward and no bubbles rose. Nothing suggested anything had been there at all. Jason reached me and asked what was wrong. I told him as best I could about the hand and the way it waved in the ring. He stared out at the lake, then at me, then gave a tight shake of his head. "This place gets in your head," he said. "Let's go back to the fire." I didn't argue. My hands shook as I reeled the line in, half expecting something to yank back. We walked to the campsite in silence. I didn't tell Emily and Tyler exactly what I'd seen, just that the dark water creeped me out more than I expected. Everyone made a couple of jokes about lake zombies and then moved on. I lay awake nearly all night, listening for water sounds outside the tent that never came. By Monday, sitting back at my desk under fluorescent lights, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Then things started happening at home. The first was the smell. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I'd wake up and my bedroom would smell like the shore of that lake, wet wood, algae, and that sour, stagnant water scent. It would hang in the air for a few minutes, then fade. I checked under the bed, the closet, and the window. Everything was dry. A couple nights later, I stepped out of bed and my socks landed in a cold, damp patch of carpet. It was right by the side of my bed, about the size of 2 footprints. The ceiling above it was dry. The wall was dry. The bathroom was down the hall. By the time I got home from work that evening, the carpet there had dried, leaving a faint, darker stain. It happened again 2 nights later. Same spot. Same damp, cold feeling. Matt noticed it one morning and asked if I'd spilled something. I shrugged and said I must have tracked in water from the shower. I didn't tell him about the lake or the hand. Saying it out loud in that small apartment felt like opening a door I couldn't close again. After a few more nights of waking up to the smell and the damp patch, I started sleeping with the TV on for background noise. About a week and a half after the trip, Matt left for a longer work run, 10 days visiting clients in different states. He texted me a picture of his cheap motel room in Ohio around 11 one night and said he was exhausted and going to bed. I answered, put my phone on the nightstand, and fell asleep to the murmur of some random show and the steady hum of the fan. I woke up later to silence. The TV screen was black, the fan was still running. The digital clock said 3:03 a.m. For a second I thought that was what had woken me up. Then I heard a voice coming from down the hall. It was muffled at first, like someone talking through a closed door. I lay there listening, heart starting to race. After a few seconds I recognized the voice. It was Matt. He sounded exactly like he did on work calls, slightly annoyed, talking about clients and numbers, giving little half laughs. I heard the floor creak in the direction of his room, like he was packing near his closet. For a brief moment, I felt relieved and thought maybe his trip had fallen through and he'd come home. I grabbed my phone. The last text from him was the motel photo from a few hours earlier. No messages since. I typed you back and listened. His voice kept talking from the other room. A moment later my phone buzzed. Nah, just got back to the hotel. Why? Another message came right after. Everything good. I stared at those words on my screen while his voice carried on down the hall. My mouth went dry. I got out of bed and my feet landed in that same cold, damp spot beside the bed. The smell of the lake hit me as soon as I opened my door, heavy and wet like the shoreline. The hallway was dark except for the faint glow from the Wi-Fi router. Matt's bedroom door was shut. His voice was coming from behind it. The closer I walked, the stranger it sounded. The words were still his, but slower now, like each one had to be forced out. Between phrases, I heard a soft drip, 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 like water hitting carpet. I stopped a couple of feet from the door. The talking stopped mid-sentence. The apartment went completely silent except for that dripping sound on the other side. Any normal person would have gone back to their room, but I didn't. I lifted my hand and knocked once lightly on the door. For a few long seconds, nothing happened. Then I heard footsteps inside the room. They didn't sound like normal steps. They dragged like bare feet sliding through something thick. They came right up to the door and stopped. The dripping got louder and steadier, like water running off a soaked body onto the floor. My phone buzzed in my hand, almost making me drop it. It was another text from Matt. Dude, are you awake? You good? I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the camera app, turned off the flash, lowered the phone, and snapped a quick picture aimed at the narrow gap between the bottom of his door and the floor. I don't know why I did it. It felt like I needed proof that something was really there. I backed away without looking at the photo, then turned and went straight back to my room. I shut and locked my door, even though I knew it wouldn't stop whatever could make that voice. I texted Matt something about being half asleep and having a weird dream and set the phone face down on the nightstand. The dripping in the hall continued, faint but steady, for what felt like a long time before it finally stopped. The next evening after work, I remembered the picture. I sat on my bed, opened my photos, and scrolled to the last one. It was dark and grainy, but you could see the bottom of Matt's door, the strip of carpet in front of it, and the thin black line of the gap under the door. I zoomed in on that gap, not really expecting to see anything. When the image sharpened, my stomach dropped. There were fingers pressed up into the gap, 4 of them flattened against the carpet, pale and wrinkled like skin that had been underwater too long. The nails had that same faint bluish tint I'd seen on the lake. The skin looked wet, there was a slight shine to it. On the ring finger, catching the dim light, was a simple silver band. It was the same hand I'd seen next to my bobber at that abandoned lakeside campground. I moved out of that apartment as fast as I could. I slept on friends' couches until I found a new place a few towns over. I never showed anyone the photo. It's still on my laptop in a folder I pretend not to see. Every now and then, usually late at night, I'll catch that same damp lake water smell somewhere it shouldn't be. A stairwell, a bus, once in the hallway of my new building when I knew no one else was there. People in that town say the lake takes more than it should. After what happened, I don't think it just takes. Standing on that dock, watching that pale hand rise and calmly wave at me, it didn't feel random. It felt like I'd been noticed. And now, whenever I wake up at 3 a.m. and the apartment is too quiet, I listen for dripping I hope I don't hear. And I picture that hand waiting on the other side of a door, trying to return from the lake to wherever I am. I found a hidden folder on my laptop one morning after a solo night fishing trip in the marshlands. When I opened it, the pictures inside showed me sleeping every single night. I'm not a tech guy. I work at an auto parts store, and when I'm not there, I'm usually out fishing. I live in a small town in Louisiana where the air always smells like mud and water, and the marsh starts about 10 minutes from my driveway. I'm used to weird sounds, weird people, and weird things out in the swamp, but nothing has ever stayed with me the way that lure did. I still don't know if it attached itself to me or if I attached myself to it. The marsh I always go to isn't some big, busy lake. It's a quiet stretch of brackish water, reeds, and cypress trees with a rotting wooden dock that nobody's bothered to repair in years. You have to drive down a narrow, cracked road, then another dirt one, then walk a little path someone beat into the grass. I like it because nobody else is ever there. No kids, no loud music, no other boats, just frogs, bugs, the distant croak of gators, and the hiss of my line hitting the water. This started late last summer. I was 26 at the time and going fishing more than usual because of some stuff going on in my personal life. My girlfriend and I had just split, and I didn't feel like talking to anyone. I'd clock out from work, grab my gear, and head straight for the marsh until it was too dark to see. It was one of those nights when the heat doesn't really go away after sunset. It just hangs there, heavy and sticky. I remember standing out on that old dock, boards soft under my boots, just casting the same cheap plastic lure I always used. The water was calm, barely moving, just a slow ripple from something moving in the reeds. I wasn't catching anything, but I didn't care. I was kind of zoned out when I noticed something stuck in a gray stump right on the edge of the water line. It was wedged in deep, almost hidden under a layer of moss and dirt. At first I thought it was a bottle cap or some junk, but when I got closer I realized it was a fishing lure. It was small and handmade, carved out of some kind of dark wood. The paint was almost gone, but I could still see faded red lines and tiny dots like eyes. 3 rusty treble hooks hung from it, sharp as needles in a way they shouldn't have been after being out in the weather that long. The weirdest part was the line. A short piece of monofilament was still tied to it, wrapped around the stump over and over, like someone had tried to secure it there on purpose. It felt wrong to touch it, but of course I did. My fingers brushed the body of it, and it felt warmer than it should have, like it had been sitting in the sun even though it was in the shade. For a second I got this light static buzz in my head, like when you stand too close to a big speaker. Then it stopped. I pulled the line free, untied it from the stump, and slipped the lure into my hand. It fit too perfectly, like it had been carved for my palm. I told myself it was just a cool find. Old fishermen carve their own lures sometimes. Maybe some guy lost this one years back. I clipped my usual lure off my line and tied the new one on. The knot I made felt tighter than any I'd ever tied, like the line wanted to lock itself to it. I stepped back to the middle of the dock, flicked open the bail, and cast. The lure cut through the air way smoother than it should have for its weight and size. The second it hit the water, I heard it. Again. Just that one word, like someone whispering right into my ear from behind me. I actually spun around so fast I almost dropped my rod. Of course, there was nothing there, just the dark water, the reeds, and the distant sound of some truck on the highway miles away. I told myself it was the wind moving through the grass, or maybe a bird I'd mistaken for a voice. My heart was beating a little too fast for how quiet everything was. I reeled in, more focused now. The lure moved in this smooth, almost hypnotic wiggle, sending tiny ripples across the surface. I flicked my wrist and cast again, farther this time. As soon as it splashed down, again, same exact voice, same exact tone. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. I stopped reeling and just stood there, listening. No one else was on the dock, and there were no boats out on the water. The hairs on my arms were standing straight up. I told myself I was just tired. I'd worked a long shift, skipped lunch, and then come out here in the heat. Maybe I was just hearing things, so I did what any stubborn person would do. I kept fishing, cast, splash, wiggle, reel in. After the 3rd or 4th cast, the voice didn't come from behind me anymore. It felt like it was inside my head, right behind my eyes, not like a thought. A thought is yours. This felt like something leaning forward inside my skull and speaking into my brain. The weird thing was, the fishing got good, too good. Every other cast something hit the lure. Bass, catfish, and even a weird long, thin thing I couldn't identify and didn't try to. They hit hard and fast, almost as soon as the lure landed. My cooler started filling up, and that whisper in my head kept nudging me. Again, farther, deeper. The more I cast, the less I thought about how strange it was. It just started to feel normal. By the time my phone buzzed, it was fully dark. The sky was this deep purple color, and the trees around the marsh had turned into tall black shapes. I glanced at the screen and froze. It was past midnight. I could have sworn I'd only been out there an hour, maybe 2. I didn't remember the sun fully going down. It was like my brain had skipped a chunk of the evening. For a second I felt dizzy, like I'd just stood up too fast. The whisper in my head went quiet, like it had gone to sleep. I packed up and headed home. The drive back was only about 15 minutes, but it felt longer. The road was empty, no other headlights, just my truck bouncing down that narrow road between dark fields and patches of water. I kept my tackle box on the passenger seat, and I remember glancing at it at a stop sign. The lure was in there, tucked neatly in a corner. I had this sudden, insane thought. If I opened the box, that whisper would start again. I didn't open it. I went home, took a quick shower, and crashed into bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up, not from a nightmare or a noise outside. I woke up because of a feeling. It was like someone had just said my name from far away, underwater. My room was dark, but I could see the outline of the blinds, cracked just a little, and a slice of orange streetlight on the floor. I listened and heard nothing but the hum of my box fan. Then, soft and clear, right inside my head, cast. The word slid through my brain like a cold finger. I sat up, breathing a little too fast, then swung my legs over the side of the bed. The floor under my feet felt damp. When I stood up, there was a faint squish that woke me up more than anything. I turned on the lamp and looked down. There were faint smears of mud on the floor next to my bed. Not big footprints, just little streaks like someone had walked through with wet shoes. My heart started pounding. I checked the window. It was locked. The front door was locked too. I told myself I'd tracked it in somehow after getting home and never noticed. I went back to bed, trying to believe that. It didn't get better after that. The next day at work, I kept hearing that whisper, not constantly, just here and there. Soon, again, back. It would happen when a customer was talking to me or when my manager was giving me instructions. I'd blink and have to ask them to repeat themselves because the voice had drowned them out. Twice I found myself standing in the aisle, just staring at the row of lures and hooks like I'd forgotten why I was there. By the 3rd day, the pressure in my head was like a mild headache that never went away. The only time it eased up was when I thought about going back to the marsh. When I finally gave in and drove out there again, the relief was instant. As soon as I stepped onto that crooked dock, it felt like someone loosened a tight band around my temples. The air smelled like algae and dead plants, and mosquitoes buzzed around me, but I felt almost welcome. I opened my tackle box and picked up the handmade lure. It looked cleaner than it had when I found it. Some of the rust on the hooks had flaked off, and the faint red paint on the wood seemed brighter. I told myself I was imagining that. I tied it on and cast. The water swallowed it with a soft plop. "Good," the whisper said. "Not again that time. Good." It sounds crazy, but the word sent this small wave of pleasure through my chest, like I'd done something right. Those trips became a habit really fast. 4 nights a week, then 5, then every night I wasn't working late. I'd tell myself I was only going out there for an hour, but I'd blink and my phone would say 1:00 a.m. to 00 a.m. I'd drive home in a fog, not remembering packing my gear or walking back down the path. My cooler was always full, but I couldn't clearly recall catching most of the fish inside it. The lure never got snagged, never broke off. It moved through the water like it belonged there more than I did. I started noticing other things too. Sometimes when I'd be standing on the dock, I'd feel the boards bend behind me as if someone else had stepped onto the wood. I'd hear that faint creak of weight shifting, the gentle knock of something brushing against the posts. Whenever I turned around, there was no one there. Once when I looked down at the water by the dock, I thought I saw another fishing line hanging just under the surface, parallel to mine, leading off into the darkness. When I blinked, it was gone. The whisper in my head laughed, low and strange. It wasn't just out there either. At home, I'd catch myself staring at the bathtub faucet while the water ran, hearing quiet words in the hiss. Deeper, stay. I stopped inviting friends over because I didn't want anyone near my gear. My buddy Jace joked one time, "Man, you're obsessed. That marsh is going to eat you one day." I laughed it off, but my hands actually tightened on my tackle box to the point where my knuckles turned white. The thought of someone else touching that lure made my skin crawl. It felt like it was mine, or I was it. I'm still not sure which. The first time I really got scared was a Tuesday night. I remember because I had work early the next morning and kept telling myself I'd only fish for a little bit. I was out on the dock, casting the lure over and over, letting that whisper guide my wrist farther, faster, slower, when the line suddenly went tight in a way I'd never felt before. Not like a fish, not like a snag either. It was like something on the other end had taken hold of the lure and was just pulling. I leaned back trying to reel in, but the line wouldn't budge. It vibrated, humming, like it ran straight into something alive. The whisper in my head grew louder, overlapping voices now, all saying the same thing over and over. Step in, step in, step in. I looked down and realized I was already at the edge of the dock, my toes hanging over the water. I hadn't meant to move. My center of gravity tilted forward like I was about to fall. Some small, panicked part of me snapped awake, and I stumbled back, letting slack into the line. The second I did, the pull vanished. The voices went dead silent. I stood there shaking, breathing hard. I cut the line with my pocket knife just above the lure so it fell and swung over the water. I told myself I would leave it there, come back later with gloves or something, and throw it away. I packed up quickly and left, not even bothering to coil my line properly. That night I decided I needed proof that I was just sleep-deprived and freaking myself out, or proof that something was really wrong. So I set my laptop on my dresser, facing my bed, and turned on the webcam. I downloaded some free motion detection program that saves pictures whenever something moves in front of the camera. I figured I'd catch myself tossing and turning, or maybe getting up to use the bathroom. If I could see it, maybe I'd feel more in control. I went to bed with my rod in the closet and the tackle box shut tight. I remember staring at the ceiling for a long time, listening to my heartbeat, waiting for that whisper. It came eventually, soft as always, cast. It felt annoyed, like I was ignoring it. I didn't move. I forced myself to stay in bed. I don't remember when I actually fell asleep. The next morning I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. My head was pounding and there was this heavy pressure behind my eyes, like I'd cried all night even though I hadn't. The laptop screen was dark. I almost forgot I'd even set it up until I saw the little icon in the corner for the motion program. I clicked it and it said there were no new files. I actually felt kind of relieved. Maybe this really was all in my head. Then I noticed a new folder on my desktop that I hadn't seen before. It was named something random, like a string of numbers and letters. It was grayed out slightly differently than the other icons, like it was hidden but not hidden well enough. I double-clicked it, and that's when I saw the photos, hundreds of them. They were all of my room, taken at night. Some were dark and some were bright from the flash of a streetlight or passing car. In almost every single one I was in bed, eyes closed, mouth slightly open. In some of them the blanket was pulled up to my chest. In others it was pushed down and twisted around my legs. First I was just creeped out that the software had been saving pictures without telling me. Then I noticed something else. In the first few pictures nothing looked too strange, but as I clicked through my position started changing. There was one where I was sitting up on the edge of the bed, head bowed, hands hanging between my knees like I was exhausted. The next showed me standing beside the bed. The next, I was at the window, one hand on the blinds. The one after that, I was gone from the frame entirely. My mouth went dry as I kept clicking. In one shot, I was standing in the doorway of my room, facing the camera directly. My eyes looked half open, but there was something wrong about them. Even in the grainy picture, they seemed too dark, like the pupils took up almost the entire eye. Worse than that was my hand. I was holding my fishing rod, and hanging from the line, swaying slightly in midair above the floor, was the handmade lure. My heart was hammering, but I couldn't stop. I clicked to the next photo. In this one, I was closer to the bed, leaning over my own sleeping body. The lure dangled inches from my face, hooks glinting in the dim light. My lips were parted like I was whispering something to myself. I zoomed in, hands shaking so badly I could barely control the trackpad. The expression on my face, it wasn't mine. I don't know how else to explain it. It looked hungry. Another detail made my stomach twist. In a few of the shots, there was a faint shape behind me. Not a clear figure, not some cliché ghost. Just an outline in the darker part of the room by the corner, like a tall, thin shadow that didn't match anything I actually had in there. In one image, my head was tilted slightly back, like something was standing right behind me and murmuring into my ear. There were timestamps on the pictures. 2:14 a.m., 2:16 a.m., 2:19 a.m. I scrolled all the way back to the earliest ones, expecting them to start from the night before. They didn't. The earliest ones were from 5 days ago, then a week ago, then almost 3 weeks back. Apparently that hidden folder had been there long before I found the lure, quietly filling up with images of me standing in my room at night, eyes half open, looking more and more wrong in each set. It was just that I'd never noticed it until that morning. I don't remember closing the laptop. I just remember standing in the middle of my room with this buzzing sound in my ears and that familiar voice pushing through the static. "You see," it said, but it didn't sound pleased or angry. It sounded patient, like it had been waiting for me to catch up. My knees almost gave out. I grabbed my keys and my tackle box and drove straight back to the marsh, like something was pulling me there with a rope. The sky was gray when I reached the dock, and the water was completely still. No breeze, no birds, nothing. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath. I opened the tackle box and picked up the lure. The wood felt alive, pulsing faintly in my palm like a tiny heartbeat. The voices in my head got louder, overlapping and layered, all whispering the same plea: "Cast, just one more, just one more." I walked to the edge of the dock, toes inches from the green-black water. My arm moved almost on its own, swinging the lure out over the surface. For a second, I could actually picture how good it would feel to just listen, to stop fighting and let it pull me under or wherever it wanted me. The pressure in my skull built until it felt like something was about to split open. I don't know what snapped me out of it. Maybe it was the memory of my own face in those photos, or the way the shadow behind me had seemed taller in each one. Instead of casting, I grabbed the lure in my fist and yanked it off the line. The hooks dug into my skin, but I didn't care. I turned and hurled it as hard as I could, not into the water, but deep into the thick reeds where the marsh drops off into some channel I've never fished. The second it left my hand, the voices screamed, not out loud, just in my head, but it was enough to make me stagger and almost fall. Then just as suddenly, they cut off. For the first time in weeks, my mind was quiet, not completely empty, just normal. The constant low-level whispering was gone. The pressure behind my eyes eased. I stood there shaking, listening to my own ragged breathing and the tiny plops of something moving in the water far out in the marsh. After a minute, I turned and walked back to my truck, leaving my tackle box sitting open on the dock like an offering I didn't care about anymore. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I went home, deleted the folder, and moved on with my life. I did delete it. I opened that hidden folder, selected all the pictures of myself standing over my own bed like a stranger, and emptied the trash. I even uninstalled the motion program, shut the laptop, and shoved it into a drawer. For a few nights, I slept better. I avoided the marsh completely. I stayed late at work, watched TV until I passed out, and kept my rod in the closet and my boots by the door. But the thing about deleting something is it doesn't always stay gone. A week ago, I opened my laptop again for the first time since all of that happened. I needed to check my bank account, nothing special. The desktop loaded up and there it was, the hidden folder, same grayish look, same random string of letters and numbers for a name. My throat went dry. I stared at it for a long time before I finally double-clicked. Inside, there weren't hundreds of photos like before, just one. A single file from the night before, timestamped at 3:07 a.m. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the laptop, but I opened it anyway. It was my room again, same angle, same dim light. I was in bed, eyes closed, facing the wall this time. The blanket was pulled up to my shoulders. I thought that was all there was at first, until my eyes adjusted to the darker parts of the image. Near the window, just inside the frame of the picture, there was a faint shape. It looked like a hand pressed flat against the glass from the outside, fingers long and thin. And right above my sleeping head, hanging in midair, was a tiny dark shape about the size of my palm with 3 sharp points catching the light. I haven't been back to the marsh since I threw the lure into the reeds. I don't plan on it, but I can't shake the feeling that something followed me home even after I let it go. Because sometimes, when I'm half asleep and the air conditioner kicks on, I can hear a sound under the hum of the fan. a soft, familiar word slipping through the back of my mind like a hook through water. Again. It was the first night fishing trip I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. I had just turned 27 that summer, and I was dealing with one of the hardest years of my life. I had moved out of my apartment after a breakup, I left a job I hated, and I didn't have many people around anymore. Fishing was something my dad used to take me to do when I was a kid, and whenever life got heavy, it was the one thing that helped my mind slow down. So in late August, I packed a small tackle box, 2 cans of beer, and a cheap flashlight, and drove 45 minutes to a small lake I found online. This lake wasn't a public tourist spot or a camping site. It was just this quiet place tucked between a row of pines and a dirt road that barely showed up on GPS. The only thing built there was a thin, older wooden dock that stretched just far enough to get me away from the weeds near shore. I didn't even see any houses around it, just trees and lake water. When I parked my car, the sky was already dark, and the only sound I heard was my shoes crunching over old leaves as I walked down to the dock. I didn't mind the darkness at first. In fact, that's what I wanted. I liked feeling like nobody else was around and nothing needed my attention. I sat down, scattered my gear out the way I wanted it, and cast my line into the water. The lake's surface had that perfect stillness that reflects the moon like a mirror. It looked peaceful, and for the first 30 minutes it felt healing. The air smelled clean, like wet wood and pine sap. The only noise was the soft sound of insects and tiny splashes from small fish near the surface. I leaned back, took a slow sip of beer, and let myself breathe for what felt like the first time in months. Everything felt quiet, controlled, and safe, the kind of silence that makes your shoulders drop and your head clear. But that calm didn't last for long. Around the 40-minute mark, the moon became covered by clouds. The darkness shifted from gentle to something heavier, and for the first time I noticed how old the dock really was. When the wind picked up, the boards under me creaked slightly, not enough to worry me, but enough to remind me how isolated I was. My phone only had 1 bar left. I remember checking it and thinking it didn't matter because I wouldn't need it, but later, I really wished I had better signal. At around what I guessed was 10:30 p.m., I felt something tug my line. It wasn't hard, just enough to break me out of my thoughts. I sat up and lightly reeled in, thinking maybe it was a small bass or catfish. But when I reeled a little more, I realized whatever was on the other end was moving strangely. It didn't feel like swimming, it felt like twitching. I reeled faster, expecting to see some tangled weeds or maybe an injured fish. The line rose out of the water slowly, and at first I only saw something dark hanging from the hook. The water dripping from it made small tapping sounds against the wood. I pulled it a little closer, and the shape didn't make sense. It wasn't a fish, but it didn't look like anything I recognized. It was about the size of a roll of socks, covered in thin, slippery skin, not scales. The color was dark gray, almost like wet clay. I remember whispering, "What the hell?" as I lifted it closer to my face. The thing wasn't dead. I could see it pulsing slightly, like breathing, but uneven and shallow. It didn't have eyes, it didn't have fins, it didn't even have a mouth, not until a second later. The skin split down the middle like it unzipped itself, and inside wasn't teeth, but a dark hole that expanded wider than it should have been able to. I jumped back so fast I almost dropped my pole into the lake. My heart started pounding, and my breathing got rough. I was holding something alive that wasn't supposed to exist. I should have thrown it back right then. Every part of my mind told me to, but I froze, not because I wanted to keep it, but because I wanted to understand what I was seeing. My curiosity beat out my fear for that one moment. I leaned closer again, trying to understand whether I just discovered some sick, injured creature, or some mutated fish from pollution, or something too young to identify. And then it made its first sound. It wasn't a squeak or a hiss. It sounded like a person trying to breathe through water, a muffled, shaking inhale that didn't match the size of the body. My entire spine went cold, but I still didn't drop it. I just stared, whispering, "No way, no, no, no," under my breath. That's when it changed. The breathing turned into something like speech. Not exact words, more like the shape of words, almost like someone talking through a thick blanket. Slow, broken attempts to form syllables. That was the moment I dropped the pole. The line snapped and the thing rolled onto the dock, twitching and making these wet, dragging sounds against the wood. I backed up, but the dock wasn't big, and my heel hit the edge fast. I pointed my flashlight at it, but the light flickered. The creature made another sound, longer this time, a sound that slowly twisted into a human voice, like someone learning to talk for the first time. The words were faint, but clear enough to understand. "Don't throw me back." I felt every hair on my body stand up. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just stared while my mind kept saying, "This isn't real, this isn't real, this isn't real." The creature slowly crawled toward me, but its movement didn't look natural. It stretched forward, then pulled its middle forward like it had no bones at all. The noise it made against the wood sounded like wet hands dragging across tile. I kicked my tackle box at it, not to hurt it, but to push it back, and it actually stopped moving. The voice came again, slightly clearer this time. See, older don't leave. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The thing wasn't dry. The liquid covering it wasn't like water, it was thicker, like clear gel. It left trails behind it that soaked into the wood, and where the liquid sat too long, the wood darkened like it was burning slowly. The smell started changing too, from like water to something chemical. I gagged and covered my mouth with my shirt. I forced myself to move, grabbing the end of my fishing rod like a handle and scooping the creature back toward the edge. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to get that gel on my skin. It kept making sounds, louder now, like it was trying to scream with no air. I slid it closer to the edge, but when it realized what I was doing, it suddenly became silent again, and that silence scared me even more. I got it to the very edge, and right before it fell off, I heard it say something clear, in a voice that sounded like a child whispering through a bathroom door. "You're not alone." I froze instantly, not because of the voice, but because seconds after it said that, I heard something move behind me on the shore. A soft step, then another. Slow, deliberate, like someone walking barefoot on wet leaves. I didn't look back, not at first. The creature slid off the dock and disappeared into the dark water without a splash. I didn't even hear ripples. I slowly turned, pointing my flashlight toward the tree line. The beam flickered again until it finally stabilized, but nothing was there. No animals, no person, just woods, but I knew what I heard. Those footsteps weren't an animal. I grabbed my tackle box without closing it, shoved everything inside the best I could, and started walking fast toward my car. The entire time I felt like someone was 10 steps behind me, but I forced myself not to run. I kept my eyes forward until I reached the path. The dock creaked once behind me, but I didn't turn to look. When I reached my car, I unlocked it, tossed my gear into the passenger seat, and slammed the door. My hands were shaking too badly to start the engine right away. I turned my headlights on to face the direction of the dock, but I couldn't see anything except trees. No movement, no animal eyes, just darkness that felt heavier than before. Finally, I drove away, not even bothering to check the mirrors for the first quarter mile. When I finally glanced, I realized I still had my flashlight on my lap, but what made my chest tighten was the long, thin streak of that clear gel smeared on its handle. I rolled the window down and threw it out without thinking twice. My heart hammered for the entire drive home. When I got back to my apartment, I closed every blind and double-checked my locks. I kept telling myself it had to be some type of unknown animal or some messed-up mutation caused by pollution. But the voice, there was no scientific explanation I could create that made sense of hearing a voice shaped like words. I didn't sleep that night. I left the kitchen light on and sat in a chair until morning, listening for any sound outside my door. The next day, I searched online to see if anyone had reported strange wildlife around that lake. I found almost nothing useful except a 5-year-old forum thread where 2 different accounts talked about something alive in the water that isn't a fish, but both users deleted their posts a month apart. I didn't respond or ask anything. I just closed the page and shut my laptop. For the next 2 nights, everything was quiet. I convinced myself that whatever I pulled out wasn't dangerous. Maybe it was trying to get help. Maybe I misunderstood everything because I was exhausted and stressed. But on the 3rd night, something happened that erased every doubt. I woke up around 4 a.m. to a noise coming from my kitchen. Not loud, just a soft clicking sound, like someone tapping their nails slowly against wood. I sat up, holding my breath. My bedroom door was cracked open an inch, and through that gap I could see the faint light shining from the microwave clock. The clicking stopped, but something else replaced it. A dripping sound. Slow, steady droplets hitting the tile. I swung my legs off the bed, grabbed my phone, and turned on the screen light. I walked slowly toward the bedroom door, not wanting to make any noise. When I reached the doorway, I pushed it open inch by inch until I could see my entire kitchen. I didn't see a person, I didn't see anything alive, but I saw wet, thin streaks on the floor, leading from the back door toward the center of the kitchen, clear streaks that looked exactly like the gel from that creature. And sitting on my kitchen counter was my fishing hook. The same one I used that night. It was placed nightly, like someone set it there for me to find. I didn't hear anything else after that. No movement, no breathing, nothing at all, but I barely slept for weeks, and I moved out of that apartment less than a month later. I never returned to that lake, and I never went night fishing again. To this day, I still think about what that thing said, especially the part that didn't make sense until later. You're not alone. It didn't mean the lake. It meant me. This happened on a cold marina night. I thought the tapping on my window was just branches, but it was. I'm 27 now, but this happened when I was 22, living in a small coastal town in Washington state. I was in my last year of college and constantly stressed, so on weekends I'd drive to the shoreline after dark just to clear my head. There was a public marina that stayed open all night, mostly for local fishermen. It sat at the far edge of town, past a bunch of closed seafood shacks and silent vacation rentals. I used to park my car near the pier, sit on the hood, and just listen to the water. It always made me feel calm, almost like I could breathe normally again. That night had a different feeling right from the moment I pulled in. It was late November, freezing, and the wind off the water felt sharper than usual. I had been arguing with my roommate earlier that evening and just wanted an excuse to get out of the apartment. When I arrived, the main overhead dock lights were flickering, which I'd never seen before. There were only 2 other cars in the small gravel lot and a few boats tied up in the marina, swaying slow and heavy in the dark water. I didn't see anyone around at first, but I noticed a small light further down the pier, like a lantern or an old flashlight. I walked toward the end of the pier like I always did, hands stuffed in my jacket pockets, hoping the wind would die down so I could relax. The wood planks under my shoes were slick and cold, and every footstep sounded too loud. The light I saw belonged to a man sitting on an upside-down crate near the edge, holding a fishing pole that hung motionless over the water. He wasn't dressed like anyone I'd seen around here. He had on a dark, heavy wool coat, some old-fashioned rubber waders, and what looked like a canvas hat pulled low over his head. His clothes looked soaked, like they hadn't dried in days. I slowed down, thinking maybe I should leave him alone, but there was nowhere else to go if I wanted to stay outside. I eventually stopped about 20 feet from him, leaned against the railing, and checked my phone, pretending to scroll, even though I didn't have cell signal out there. After a minute or two, he spoke without turning toward me. His voice was deep, but it sounded like someone talking through cold air, like they hadn't used their vocal cords for a long time. He said, "You picked a strange hour for wandering." I froze a little because I didn't think he even noticed me. I just said something like, "Yeah, I like the quiet," and tried to laugh it off. He didn't laugh, he didn't move, he just said, "Quiet is only peaceful if you're the only thing listening." I thought maybe he was some eccentric old local who drank too much or took his personal philosophies seriously. I nodded and stared out over the water, trying to not make it awkward. The waves made hollow slaps against the dock posts, and I could hear the metal ring of some boat ropes clicking in the breeze. It was the only sound besides his low breathing. I told him I'd never seen him around town, and he said, "Been here longer than anyone." Something in the way he said it gave me goosebumps. After a few moments, curiosity got the better of me. I asked if he came out here often, and he replied, "I wait." He didn't say what he was waiting for, and I didn't know if I should ask. The way he faced the water without even blinking or shifting started to bother me. His posture never changed, not even slightly. It was like he was locked in place by something heavier than the cold. There was no tackle box, no bait, no bucket, no cooler. Just the rod, the line, and his body that looked as rigid as a statue. I tried making small talk, mostly because silence felt worse than hearing his weird comments. I asked what he was fishing for at that hour. His answer made no sense. He said, "What was taken always tries to return. You just have to be here when it rises." I didn't know if he was talking about real fish, some local legend, or some trauma I definitely didn't want to pry into. The wind rattled the pier and I saw his coat flap a little, but his hands didn't tremble, even though the air felt like ice. I noticed then that his fingers were pale, not just pale from cold, but almost gray. At this point I felt uncomfortable enough to start thinking about heading back to my car, but I also felt weird just walking away mid-conversation. I asked if he lived nearby or had a boat here, and he told me he used to have the best boat in the harbor until the storm. His voice cracked a little on the last word, but it didn't sound emotional, more like his throat was damaged. I turned my head slightly to look at him better, and that's when I noticed his collar and sleeves were dripping, not just damp. The water looked black and almost thick, like his clothes were soaked all the way through. I looked around for any older, weather-beaten boat he might have belonged to, but I didn't see anything that matched. The boats tied here were mostly newer models, shiny and well-maintained. None looked like something from decades ago. I glanced back again and asked when the storm happened. He replied with a short phrase, "Before the lights." I didn't know what that meant, and I couldn't tell if he meant the marina lights, town electricity, or something symbolic. His tone made me feel like the conversation was slipping into something I wasn't equipped to understand. The longer I stood there, the more wrong everything felt. The light near him wasn't actually a flashlight or lantern. It looked like an old-fashioned oil lamp, the kind with a glass chimney and metal base. The flame inside flickered fast, almost too fast, but the wind wasn't even hitting it. I took a tiny step back, and that's when he suddenly spoke again, still facing the water. "You should leave before it returns. You're not tied to it, not yet." His words hit me like a sudden drop in stomach pressure, and for a second I wondered if he was threatening me or warning me. I finally decided to walk away, slowly, acting like nothing was wrong. I said I needed to get home before it got too late. He didn't acknowledge me. He didn't nod, didn't grunt, didn't shift. I remember staring at the side of his head before I turned away, thinking how his skin looked unusually smooth for someone so old. I walked back toward the parking lot with that uneasy jolt in my chest that you get when something feels seriously off, but you're trying to rationalize it. The gravel felt loud under my shoes, like the whole marina was listening. Halfway back, I glanced over my shoulder just to confirm he was still there. He hadn't moved, not even his head still staring ahead. The line from his fishing pole wasn't even touching the water. It was just hanging slack above it, rocking slightly with the wind. When I got inside my car, I locked the doors immediately and turned on the engine. My heater blasted my face, and I tried to shake off the weird vibe, convincing myself he was just some old man who'd been through something tragic. As I shifted into reverse, my headlights swept across the pier. He was still there, exactly the same posture, like someone had frozen him mid-moment. I drove home, faster than usual, constantly checking my mirror even though there was no logical reason to. When I got home, I showered, made tea, and turned on the TV just to have sound around me. I eventually fell asleep around 3 in the morning. The tapping woke me up. It wasn't harsh like knocking, more like something lightly hitting the glass. I sat upright in bed, thinking maybe a tree branch was loose outside. The tapping continued, slow and steady, not random like wind movement. I lived on the second floor. There were no trees close enough to reach my window. The tapping stopped after maybe 10 seconds, and I convinced myself I dreamed it. The next morning I told my roommate about the weird guy at the marina, but he brushed it off, saying coastal towns always had dock ghosts and people who believed in sea folklore. I asked him if he'd ever seen anyone at the marina dressed like it was the 1950s. He joked that maybe I saw a time traveler. It frustrated me because I couldn't shake the image of that man's soaked clothing and motionless body. Something was wrong with that scene, and I felt it deep in my chest. 2 nights later, I returned to the marina, not because I wanted to, but because I wanted proof he was real. I told myself I'd only stay for a minute. When I got there, the place was almost empty again. This time, there were no other cars. Every dock light worked perfectly, and there was no sign of the old man or his oil lamp. No crate, no fishing rod, nothing. I walked to the end of the pier slowly, expecting to see something left behind, but the boards were dry and clean. What happened next is the part that still keeps me uneasy. As I leaned over the railing and looked down into the dark water, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Beneath the surface, caught on one of the lower support posts, was a torn piece of brown waterproof fabric, identical to the coat he was wearing. It waved back and forth under the water, stuck on something. I backed up quickly, my whole body buzzing with fear. I turned around to leave, but before I stepped off the pier, I saw a small, rusted brass plaque attached to the railing near the gate. I had walked past it dozens of times and never noticed it. It had one engraved line beneath a date from the 1950s. The line said, "In memory of Captain Harris, lost at sea, body never recovered." I didn't breathe for several seconds. The wind suddenly blew colder and I heard faint footsteps behind me, slow and heavy, like soaked boots hitting wood. I didn't turn around, I just walked straight ahead, trying not to run, keeping my eyes forward. The footsteps continued for several seconds, then stopped completely. When I reached my car, I got in, locked the doors, and drove away, not even checking the mirror this time. I didn't go back to the marina for months after that. The last part happened 2 weeks later. I woke up around 4 a.m. to that same tapping on my window. I froze in bed and listened. After 10 seconds, it stopped again. I waited for my breathing to slow down, then got up and pulled my blinds open just enough to peek outside. There was no one there, but the glass had water streaks running down it, even though it wasn't raining and the rest of the window was bone dry. I moved out of that apartment a month later, and even though I live states away now, I still avoid docks and marinas. Sometimes late at night, I think about that man's voice, his wet clothing, and how he never blinked, not even once. And every now and then, when my house gets too quiet, I swear I can almost hear faint footsteps behind me, slow and heavy, just waiting for me to look back.